Looking at this really, really closely, and for you as teachers, reporting exactly what's going on in the classroom is going to help these committees make the right decision. Okay? It's really, really important. Okay? All right, manifestation determinations and developing functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. A lot of times our kids get in trouble. I was a middle school person, then I was a principal at a high school. Believe me, kids get in trouble. And especially when they're in special ed, once you have suspended them, put them in school suspension, done kinds of things where you've taken them out of their educational placement, you only have 10 days you can do that. Before you reach those 10 days, you have to have a manifestation determination. And basically all that is we meet as a committee, go over what happened, go over the goals, go over the plan we have in place, where they are in the classroom, that kind of thing, and discuss whether what he did is related to the disability. Most times it's not, but there are times where it is. And if it isn't, well, they go along and you can do regular types of discipline procedures, sending them to alternative schools, expelling them, whatever it is. If it is tied to the disability, then the art committee gets to decide, well, you know what? Yes, it was a link and a manifestation of their disability, but we're still going to send them to alternative school. Or no, and they go back to the campus. I have a story for you, and this is a true story. We had a kiddo several years ago who was in our extended school year service, which is for really low functioning, intellectually disabled kids. And he had autism, severe autism. And he's a good kid, sweet kid. Family worked with our district very well. He went to extended school year every year. Well, after, 4th of July weekend, he came back to school because they have that break and then they come back and that kind of thing. And basically what extended school year services is, for those kids that regress after a long break and cannot recoup skills, you got to continue through those breaks and through summer so they don't lose those critical needs skills. And this was a kid that needed that service. So on 4th of July weekend, Mom and Dad used his backpack to go wherever they went on their picnic. Well, they forgot to take the cans of beer out of the backpack when he got on the bus. This kid had no clue there was a beer can in his backpack. Well, he gets on, he goes to his seat on the bus, and this beer can rolls out of his backpack into the front of the bus driver. The bus driver writes him up, he goes to hearing. And we are trying to say, look, you don't want to take this kid to hearing. He has the mental intelligence of a 3-year-old. He did not know there was beer. And the mom is like, do you really know my son? This kind of thing. And we finally had to tell her, because the hearing officers, they're, he broke the law, this kind of stuff. So we're like, okay, just come to the hearing, it'll be okay. Bring your son. Okay? So he gets in, he comes in, and he's sitting at the table, and the hearing officer starts his little spiel. And he's like, oh, well, we find he's been in violation of the student code of conduct, and then all of a sudden the little boy says, blue, blue, blue. And we know this kid, and we're like, oh, you want the blue marker? So we go and get him the blue marker, and he starts to color. And it's like color. And the hearing officer is kind of like, and the mom is just sitting there. And then you see him go, red, red. Yeah, you get the red color. And the hearing officer looks over there. Okay, this case is dismissed. And then
Okay, if I could have your attention, please. We're going to go ahead and start with this session. Okay, first of all, I want to welcome you to Advocating for English Language Learners with Dr. Wainwright. Dr. Wright is an associate professor of bicultural bilingual studies at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and the director of the Masters of Teaching English as a Second Language program. His research on language and education policies and programs for linguistic minority students has been published widely in leading academic journals and in books by leading publishers. He is the author of Foundations for Teaching English Language Learners, Research, Theory, Policy, and Practice. Dr. Wright has over 10 years of experience as an ESL and bilingual teacher, working in public schools in Southern California, and has also taught ESL overseas. He is the father of 3 children, with 2 in middle school and 1 in high school. Dr. Wainwright.
Okay, is mic on? Yes, we're on. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back. I know it's hard to come back from lunch on time, so I really appreciate that. How many of you are currently a classroom teacher or an administrator? Okay, and then how many of you are going to be in the classroom probably the next few years? Okay, excellent. How many of you just kind of wandered in because you had nothing better to do on a Saturday? All right, good to see you guys too. All right, so just a brief intro, and I appreciate the introduction I got there. You heard him say that I was a bilingual and an ESL teacher. And so when you hear bilingual, you assume that my second language is what? Spanish, right? But there are 5,999 other languages besides English and Spanish. And so actually my second language is Cambodian. And this was me several years and several pounds ago, back in 1998. And I taught kindergarten for 3 years. I taught a 1-2 combination, and then I taught second grade for a few years after that. And so this picture is with my second graders. I wish I had a picture for my kindergarten because I actually had 33 kindergartners all by myself. And so this was after class size reduction that we went through in California, where I went from having 33 one year to 20 the next year. And I kept pinching myself waiting for the next 15 or 17 to come walking in. But it really made a big difference to have that class size reduction. And it was a Cambodian bilingual class. It was one of the first Cambodian bilingual programs in the country. And we had to create all of our own materials. We had to recruit our own teachers. And I went through an alternative certification program because there were no university-based programs for certifying Cambodian bilingual teachers. But it was through this experience, really working with the kids there, and also working in other types of classrooms. I worked in ESL, sheltered English immersion, mainstream type classrooms. And so I really got a good view in terms of what kind of programs are out there, what teachers are dealing with and struggling with, and what the students are struggling with. And that was really the impetus for my career going forward, to really try to understand what we can do to best serve, how to have good policies and how to have good effective programs for English language learners. So that's really what I'm going to focus on today. Okay, so let's look nationally, and I don't know if you got to see some of these figures earlier today, but this is the national growth that we've seen. And the dark lines here, that's the growth of the English language learner population from 1994 till 2010. And the growth rate, from a low of 30% to a high now of 64%. And these little green ones right here is the total student population growth. And so you can see here that our English language learner population is exploding, is growing at a much higher rate than our total student population. And so what that means, of course, is that there's a great deal of diversity, and our class is becoming more and more diverse, but also becoming more and more challenging as we have students who are coming into school who may not be as proficient in the language as we've traditionally had. Just to clarify this too, so that's about 10% of all students in the U.S. are English language learners. About 80% of those are Spanish speakers. And the majority are U.S.-born citizens. And so when you hear people complain about all these immigrants coming in and ruining our schools, well, guess what? Most of these kids are American kids, born in the United States, U.S. citizens. And so that's literally about 2/3 of the population are U.S.-born citizens. Now, again, if we look at all student growth since 94, only 4%. ELL student growth since 1994, 64%. Let's look more specifically at Texas, okay? So in Texas, we had 838,494 ELLs as of the 2012. So that's the latest data from the PIMS. 15%, so we actually have a higher percent of ELLs in Texas than we do nationally, okay? And that's at about 47% increase from 2000. Now, what's interesting about Texas is we actually have a 17% increase in the total student population. So that means that in Texas, we're growing both from all students. A lot of people are moving to Texas, especially here in San Antonio. We've seen a lot of new schools built in certain parts of the city. But still, that ELL growth is much faster even than that large regular student increase, okay? And 91% of the ELLs in Texas are Spanish speakers. So we have a higher percentage of Spanish speakers here. But I just want to point out a few things about that 9% that are not Spanish speakers, okay? That makes up about 75,464 other ELLs. Those kids represent over 120 different languages in our school system. And if you were to take the total population of 30 other states, they have less ELLs than our 9% of non-Spanish ELLs. And if you were to take several states, add up all their ELLs together, that's still less than our 9%, our 75,000 of non-Spanish speaking ELLs. So I want to make sure that when we talk about ELLs, that we're really talking about all the students that we need to be working with. And I'm sure that several of you have kids in your classrooms that represent a lot of these different languages that are being spoken. Okay, so some of the challenges that we have right now. We have our No Child Left Behind that is still with us. And we've been dealing with the tax, and now we have this wonderful thing called the STAR. Okay? And so, what I want to mention to you about that. So, first, No Child Left Behind. Next year, 2014, every kid in America is going to pass the test. You're laughing. But that's literally what it says. Every kid in America will be proficient. All the English language learners, all the special education kids, all the economically disadvantaged. Every kid is going to pass the test this year, and you laugh because clearly that's not going to happen. Congress has refused so far to deal with the issue. They have not yet reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So what's happened now is Obama administration has bypassed Congress, has offered waivers to 34 different states to be relieved from all these things within No Child Behind. Texas, however, is not one of those. I heard a rumor that they might be submitting something by the end of this month, but if they don't get something submitted, it'll be too late. So unfortunately, No Child Left Behind is still with us here in Texas. But the bottom line, it's been an epic failure, a complete objective failure. There was no one left in Congress. There are no politicians advocating for it anymore. Everyone acknowledges it's broken, but yet it's still here with us. 13 out of 16 school districts in San Antonio have been labeled failing under No Child Left Behind, so a lot of you are probably in those districts. There's actually a lawsuit right now. There's over 100 school districts in Texas that are suing to block the sanctions that are associated with failing to make AYP. And so we'll see what happens with that. So even without No Child Behind, and by the way, when I say that all these school districts are failing, that doesn't mean that you as teachers or the students have failed. It means the system has failed, right? Because it's not capturing what the kids are actually learning. It's not capturing what you're actually teaching. And so that's going to be a big focus on my presentation today, to look at ways that we can capture that since this system is so messed up. Okay, now what about the STAR? Okay, that was supposed to fix everything, right? That's a complete fiasco too, as I'm sure you know. The problems with it are delaying now its uses for accountability. So as far as I understand, kids won't be held back depending on their STAR results. There was this idea that 50% of the STAR test is going to be used for grades, and that's now been contested. And really, we're kind of seeing a high-stakes testing revolt here in Texas right now, which is kind of exciting in a way. Rick Scott, our former commissioner, quit over this issue. He used to be a supporter of high-stakes tests, and now he's actually saying that we've gone overboard with it. 600 school districts have sued the state over school finance issues. And so I don't know if you saw that, but on Monday, we won. We won. And part of the big issue was we have an increase in students. We have an increase, as I just showed you, in English language learners. And we're now increasing the amount of testing and accountability at the same time that we slashed billions of dollars from the school education budget. And so Judge Dietz was the judge who ruled in this, and he basically said there is no free lunch. We either want to increase standards and are willing to pay the price, or we won't. So in other words, you can't jack up the expectations and then slash the budget. That's not right. So I'm not sure what's going to happen from this point forward, but so far that's a good sign. So again, what all this means, these are things that we have to deal with, that we have to live with. It's frustrating, but we can't rely on policymakers to tell us what is good, effective instruction. We can't allow policymakers to dictate to us the best things we can do to meet the needs of students in the classroom. And so we have to do that on our own. That's really our job. And so I'll be focusing on that. Now, just to kind of give you a little bit of an illustration, I did a research study a few years ago involving 2 newcomer English language learners. And so I'm not going to do the whole research presentation. I just want to give you some highlights of this. And this can kind of represent maybe some of the kinds of students that you have in your schools and your classrooms as well, and some of the challenges associated with that. So I call these 2 girls Nita and Bora. Those are pseudonyms. And they were placed in a 5th grade classroom in a suburban intermediate school in the San Antonio, Texas area. Okay, I'm not supposed to tell you which shirts they're below, so I won't mention that. They came from a poor village in Cambodia, from the Takeo province. And their father sponsored them and the girls, or they were sponsored along with their father by some relatives that live here in Texas. And so they arrived right after Halloween, or I'm sorry, I think it was right before Halloween. So school had already been in session for 2 months. They spoke no English. In fact, they didn't even know they were coming to America. The uncle showed up in Cambodia, said, pack your bags, you're going to America. A week later, they're on a plane, and a couple days later, they're in the school. So they had no preparation really to come. They were placed in this mainstream classroom because the school didn't have any bilingual programs. They didn't have any self-contained ESL or sheltered instruction programs. And there were really only 3 other ELLs in the whole school, but they were at the intermediate and advanced levels. But under our wonderful policies, they were expected to take and pass the tax test that year in English in less than 6 months. Okay, so a little bit about this school. Okay, and I imagine this school is not nearly as diverse as the schools that you guys work in. But they had 590 students in grades 5 and 6. White students made up 58%, Hispanic only 29%, and then 10% African American and 2% Asian. Middle class neighborhood, only 31% free and reduced lunch compared to 53% as a statewide average. And of course, the ELLs were less than 1%, and they got that academically acceptable rating for the 2004-2005 school year. Now, so the two students lived with their aunt and uncle, and they previously lived in this little small hatchet with no running water, electricity, and now they're living in this two-story, mansion, quote unquote, in Shirt-Cibolo area. So it was a far cry from what they were used to. So you can imagine some of the cultural adjustment issues that they were going through. Now, in their school, they were both considered top students. Okay, Nita had completed the 6th grade, and Bora had completed the 5th grade. And they both had very strong reading and writing skills in Khmer, the native language of Cambodia, and they had good arithmetic skills. Neither had learned English before they arrived, but they proved to be really, really intelligent. They were like sponges. You teach them something, they just absorb it up. And they showed a great deal of courage and enthusiasm as they learned to adjust to the new country, the new language, and the new school. A little bit about the education system. I want to bring this up because it's important for us to understand the background, the educational background that students come to us. And right now we're receiving a lot of students who are refugees from places like Africa, the Middle East, Burma, Pakistan, other places. And so to understand what students have been through before they come to the classrooms are critical for us to be able to understand how to best meet their needs. So the education system in Cambodia was still recovering at the time that they came. They'd been recovering for about 2 decades from civil war and genocide. During this Khmer Rouge period from 1975 to 79, schools were shut down. Teachers were executed. Many died of disease or starvation. Many of the survivors, so any of the teachers and other educated people who survived, fled the country and then came as refugees to America and other countries. And so that meant that there were very few educated people left behind to rebuild the education system. So that's what they've been struggling with over the last 20, 30 years or so. So despite those problems, they've made some good progress, and I've actually been involved in research projects going into Cambodia and working with the schools there, so I'm familiar with the issues there. A lot of the schools lack water, electricity, bathrooms, or even walls or roofs. There's still quite a few villages that don't even have a school. Average class size is from 40 to 60 students, so a lot bigger than my 20 students that I used to have. Most of the students attend only half day, and there's high dropout rates, even among elementary students, and especially among female students. And so understanding this really made me admire these two girls more because I know that they were in a small minority of girls who would continue their education up to that level. Okay, and then among the teachers, because we had that dearth of educated people, most of the elementary school teachers have not graduated from high school. As long as you've completed, in the early days, if you finished 3rd grade, you could teach 2nd grade. If you finished 2nd grade, you could teach 1st grade. So that's how desperate they were at the beginning. Now they require that you have at least an 8th grade education in order to become an elementary school. Okay? So 69% of the teachers in the province where Nita and Bora came were in that situation. And of course, there's this great lack of materials, educational teaching materials. Small, short, poor quality paperback books are printed on cheap paper. If they're lucky, that's what they have. Many schools, sometimes the teacher has the only copy. She'll copy everything on the chalkboard, and the kids will copy everything into their own notebooks that they had to buy with their own money, if they have money. And so in some schools, teachers don't even have the book, so they're just winging it with what they got. And so when we look at math instruction, because the study kind of focused on math since that's what they were expected to perform on that year, math instruction in Cambodia really only covered basic arithmetic and problem solving. And it's far below, if you think about our TEKS. Okay, it's nowhere near what we expect of our students in math through the TEKS. In fact, I did a comparison. I got the textbook that they would have used in 4th grade, and I compared that with the textbook that their fellow 5th graders had used the previous year when they were in 4th grade. And this is really kind of an opportunity to learn analysis. Okay? How much opportunity do they have to learn the material before they're going to be facing it on the tax test? So just as a general thing, you saw 96 pages of the Cambodian textbook versus 573 pages of the American textbook. And then the number of problems, is less than a quarter. Opportunities to learn and solve problems, and plus they didn't cover all the topics that we would expect to cover. So you're the school teacher. Imagine you get these two girls in October. What do? Okay? And the first thing this teacher did was she panicked. And she shed some tears, and she really wanted to help these students but wasn't really sure what to do. But then she talked to people and she started digging around and looking for resources. And I was actually quite impressed with some of the things the school and this teacher did to help the students. First thing, of course, is differentiated instruction. She didn't expect these students to be able to do the same exact work that all the other kids were doing. She would try to find things on similar topics, but maybe at a lower grade level or in a simplified manner, so they were learning the same things as their peers, but that was a little bit more accessible. She found some bilingual Khmer dictionaries, picture dictionaries and things, and got those for her students. She encouraged them to write translations of words on their own schoolwork. So she wasn't one of these teachers like, only speak English in this classroom, you have to learn English. She recognized that the primary language is a valuable resource in helping students learn English and adapt. So that was nice to see. And there was work on the classroom computer where she found some software programs that were more appropriate to their level and let them work on those when the other students were doing other things. The school did have an ESL teacher, and normally she was only at the school 2 days a week. But once these girls came, she arranged her schedule so she could be there 5 days a week. And she worked with them about 45 minutes a day, and they focused on vocabulary development and basic reading. And then they got individualized instruction from a paraprofessional. So the school realized, you know what, just an hour of ESL a week isn't enough. These girls need a lot more. And so the counselor had a paraprofessional that she assigned to work with the girls. And this woman didn't necessarily have any training in ESL. And she was the kind of person who was just one of those people with bubbly personalities who loves to talk and never shuts up. So we call that oral language heaven. And she loved these girls, and they loved her. And it was probably as effective, not more, than probably the official ESL instruction they were getting. And the teachers would provide them with activities and lessons to work on, but a lot of times they just talked. And so that really helped their oral language development. And then in the computer lab, they were able to have some differentiated instruction through software programs that could try to determine where the students were at and then move them up from there. And they realized that that still wasn't enough, and so they searched far and wide in San Antonio to find out, is there anyone in this town who can speak Cambodian? And to make a long story short, somehow they found me, and I had just moved into San Antonio like 2 months. And so that tells you how hard this teacher worked to find somebody. And so I was able to go out, 1 day a week for an hour, and the teacher would prepare stuff that they had struggled to work with them on all week, and then I would help them out in Cambodian with the materials. And it was kind of exciting because there's something that, like adding fractions or something, and they had done everything they could to try to shelter that in the classroom. It just wasn't working. I'd come in and I'd say things like 2 or 3 sentences and explain how it works, and they go, oh, and then they just start doing it. And then one of the students said to me, when you explain it in Khmer, it's so easy. And so we think about, again, these little things that can be done to help students make big progress, and again, the primary language as an asset to be used. And so luckily the school valued that. Now let's talk about the TAKS test. So they had to take that math TAKS test. And I wanted to get an idea of what was the language of the TAKS like versus the language of the math materials that they were using on a daily basis in the classroom. And what were those language demands like? So a very simple analysis was, well, of all the math worksheets they completed, how many questions were there, how many words were there, how many unique words? And so it looks like, hey, we had 603 unique words on the math worksheets, and the TAKS math test only had 491 words. So they got a lot of exposure to vocabulary, right? Take that to a little bit deeper level and look at the kind of vocabulary that was on these worksheets and on the math TAKS test. And so we have the first 1,000 content words, the, and, of, those kind of simple words. Second 1,000 words, a little bit less common. And then we get into specific academic words and off-list math words, okay? And so when we compare, yes, they had 327 unique words, but only 85 of those were math words. And you compare that with the math TAKS test, 141 were specifically related to math. And so again, how much opportunity did they really have to learn that material before they were tested on it? Okay? And I'm not saying this is the fault of the teacher or anyone. I'm saying that's an unrealistic expectation that they would be able to learn all that in time to be able to take that test. Now, academic issues related to language aren't just related to vocabulary, but also things like syntax. That's the grammar. And so what this chart represents here, the blue lines are different syntactic features or structures that you would find in sentences, things like multiple clauses, passive voice, things like that. So the blue is what was in the TAKS questions, the red was what was on the worksheets. You can see here that not only was there a greater variety of different types of syntactic features on the TAKS test that they never had exposure to, but there was also many more of each kind too. So again, how much language opportunity did they have to be adequately prepared to take that assessment? It really wasn't reasonable. So how did they do? Out of 44 questions on that math TAKS test, Nita got 6 out of 44 and Bora got 7. Now, ironically, Nita was the older one who knew more math, was better at it, and was really, really trying to do well on the test. Bora, on the other hand, right in the middle of the test, she bubbled in 5 answers in a row. She yelled out, bingo! So how's that for a valid and reliable assessment there, right? So the one who randomly guessed actually got a higher score than the one who was actually trying. And so this also really speaks to the limitations and problems with these assessments that we're expecting the kids to do. So when I was thinking about this situation, it reminded me of this demotivational poster. Failure, when your best just isn't good enough. Okay. So what I want to try to do is reconceptualize what we mean by failure, what we mean by success. Because clearly the way that the system has been set up for students like Nita and Bora, now of course these are extreme cases, these are newcomer ELLs, which we all have. But we also have students who have been here for several years who are long-term ELLs, who also have a variety of language issues that haven't been adequately addressed in the classroom or through the system. And so we've really got to rethink in terms of how do we measure success. And if we as classroom teachers try to measure our success based on how well they do on these standardized tests, we're going to be pretty depressed people because it's a fixed system that really is biased against the students, and they're not going to be able to be successful on it. So I want to focus now in terms of other ways to think about that success and other things that we can do in the classroom to make sure they're being successful. So just some of the guiding questions, and I apologize, the handout you have is a very simplified version of this, and so I'm going to ask them to go ahead and post my full PowerPoint on the website later if you want to have access to all these links. But you have the basic outline there. So what are the characteristics of effective programs? What are some strategies that we can do to be advocates for the students? Just like we saw the teacher in that one school, all the things that she did to make sure that her students were getting services that they need. How can we promote ELL parental involvement? And then we'll touch briefly on perhaps conducting research in your own classroom as a way to better inform your instruction. So when it comes to programs for English language learners, there's a lot of different programs. There's English medium type models, and then there's bilingual type models. But I want to try to simplify that by saying that any program for English language learners, where it's bilingual or an English-based model, has to have these components. The first component is standards-based ESL instruction, or sometimes it's called ELD, English Language Development Instruction. And there's 2 ways that this has traditionally been provided. One is through the pull-out model. ESL teacher shows up, pulls the kids out, teaches them for 45 minutes or so, and then sends them back to the classroom. And the other one is in class, where the classroom teacher herself or himself is authorized and trained to provide that instruction in the classroom. And when they do so, it's not, oh, I teach ESL all day. It's ESL is from 9 o'clock to 9:30 or 10 o'clock to 10:45. Just like we schedule math, we schedule ESL instruction. Okay, and then the second thing that they have to have is standards-based content area instruction. So they have to be learning the same content as all the other students. And so there's 2 ways to provide that. One is we can do that in the native language, so that would be through a bilingual approach. Or if we don't have that ability, or we have kids in the class who speak 20 different languages, and you don't speak all 20 languages, okay, which is forgivable, we'll understand that. Then we need to probably use a different type of approach, such as sheltered instruction, where 1 or more content areas are taught in English, but using a variety of sheltered instruction activities to make that instruction comprehensible. And I should point out, too, that even when we have native language instruction, you really have a combination of both, right? They start out mostly with native language instruction, and then as they start to move up in grade level, the level of native language instruction decreases while the level of amount of sheltered instruction increases, okay? And then we also need primary language support. Now, there's a difference between primary language support and native language instruction. In native language instruction, you're actually teaching a content area in that language. Whereas in primary language support, everything is being taught in English, but you might be able to use little bits and pieces of the native language to provide support. And I argue that even if you don't speak the native language of the student, you can still find ways to provide primary language support. So in the example I gave earlier, the teacher went out and she found some books and materials in the Khmer language. She allowed the girls to write in Khmer. They found a volunteer to come in and help. So there are ways of providing that support even if you don't speak that language. Okay, so what are the different characteristics? First, a quality program ensures that ELLs attain proficiency in English. One of the things that we have under No Child Left Behind is Title III. And Title III actually has separate, it calls for separate English language proficiency standards and English language proficiency assessments. And so in Texas, that's the TELPAS, right, that you deal with, okay? So the effective programs need to make sure that the students are receiving the kind of instruction they need to be able to do well on the TELPAS, and we want to have 2 kinds of goals. One, we want to make sure that kids are moving up at least one level every year. And we also want to have a goal in terms of how many students redesignate from being an English language learner to being a fluent English proficient student. Okay? So those are the two main goals under that. And the only way to make sure that they achieve that goal is to make sure that we're providing instruction in that area. So I always get dismayed when I hear that some schools or districts don't have a specific ESL curriculum and an ESL time. Because that'd be like saying, oh, we want all the kids to be proficient in MASH, but we don't schedule math in the curriculum. And we say, oh, I teach math all day because we count to 10 in the morning and I point to the clock when it's time to do things, so that's my math instruction. It's not sufficient, is it? And so to be able to meet those goals, we have to make sure that we have systematic, regularly scheduled ESL or ELD instruction. Okay, then we need to make sure that the ELLs have that equal access to the core curriculum. So how do we make sure that they're learning the same things that all the other students are learning? And again, that goes to either doing it through a bilingual approach, or if we do it in English, making sure that we're sheltering it, that we're finding ways to modify the instruction. In Texas, we use the term linguistically modified, that we're linguistically modifying the materials, the curriculum, and our instruction to make it comprehensible. And some of you have probably been through SIOP training, okay, that gives you a model for doing that. And then there's GLAD training and a few others that are out there, but they're all basically kind of give us ideas about how we can simplify things, not watering it down, still grade level stuff, but making it so it's comprehensible. Okay, good programs value students' native languages. Okay? And so we saw some good examples of this in the case study a minute ago, where even though it's not a bilingual program, we recognize that the students' native language is a resource for helping them learn English, for helping them learn content. And it's always unfortunate when we see ELLs in classrooms where the teachers have an English-only policy of you can't speak that language in here. And not only does that cut off a valuable resource, but it also sends a horrible message to students about the value of their native language. And we really want to be able to cultivate both of those as much as we can. Making use of multiple ongoing authentic assessments. And I'll give you some specific examples of that in a minute. But the bottom line is we know that the standardized system at the state and federal level is broken, which means we have to have our own system to be able to document students' progress and growth. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. Have teachers who are fully credentialed to work with ELLs. Okay? And so as we see that growing number of ELLs, not only in Texas but across the country, that means ELLs are showing up in classrooms of teachers that haven't had ELL students before, that may have gotten a credential, a generalist credential, and they're a fantastic teacher, but once they start getting those ELL students in their classroom, then it's important for those teachers to go and get the additional training that they need. And so hats off to all of you for being here, because that's really a part of that process. And then have teachers who are advocates for ELL students and their families. It's one thing to have ELLs in your classroom, but it's a whole other thing to be able to be fighting for them and trying to do what you can to help them, just like we saw the teacher in the case study. And I'll give you some specific ideas of things that we can do in the area of advocacy. And then ongoing professional development opportunities for teachers and administrators. The research is really clear on that. Okay? We need as many opportunities as we can to learn new skills, to learn new ideas and strategies. I mean, I was a classroom teacher for several years, and it's very isolating, right, to be in that classroom all by yourself, and you only see your colleagues during, well, we used to have recess. I don't think we have that anymore. Maybe during the teacher's lounge or something, and then you go to the meetings, and it's all administrators talking and us taking notes. So how often do we really have a chance to get together with other educators who are dealing with similar issues and sharing ideas with each other? And that's really the value of professional development. And that's, again, why something like what Ate is doing today is really important. And then promoting active parental involvement. And I'll give you a few ideas on how that can be done as well. Okay, so first in terms of advocating, I've been bashing all these horrible federal and state policies, okay? But the one good thing about them, the only one good thing about them, is that it's raised awareness of the needs of English language learners. Before, we could just kind of ignore the students. Oh, they're not going to be tested for a few years, and nobody's really looking at them anyways, but we can't ignore them anymore. And so schools are aware, principals are aware, and so one of the things that you can do is, you know that there's funds out there like through Title III and others. Go to your administrator and say, how are we using those? I could really use these ESL materials. I could really use this software program. I could really use, some after-school programs, and let's use that money for that. And then if you can be the go-to person on your campus, where if the other, and probably a lot of you do this already, but they have a student in their class who's an ELL, and they don't know what to do with them, they'll come to you for advice, for suggestions, for resources, for materials to look over their student work. And so that's another way that we can advocate for them there at the school level. Title III is specifically for ELLs. And so every state gets a huge chunk of money, then they're supposed to divide that out to the districts, and the districts are supposed to divide that out to the schools. And so you want to find out how that money is being used. Okay, it's out there. Okay? This is the point I really want to emphasize in the presentation, and that is we need to keep our own data to show the progress of ELLs, both in learning English and in learning academic content. And so what we need is we need data from multiple alternative authentic assessments. I'm not talking about those horrible benchmarks we have to give every 9 weeks. That's just pseudo-tax or pseudo-star tests, right? More authentic stuff, you know, the kinds of things that they would do in regular instruction, the kinds of things that you can observe and really see how they're using language in the areas where they have strengths and the areas where they need some more instruction, okay? And then we need ways to synthesize that so that it can be shared with parents, it can be shared with policymakers, it can be shared with the public and school administrators. And so let me give you just an example. I got a hypothetical student here named Trin, and let's say that she's a third grade student, and she just started school at the beginning of the year, and she'd only been in the country maybe a few years before that, okay? And when Trin took the state tests at the end of the school year, she failed, okay? So then, therefore, someone could point to me and say, I'm a horrible teacher, I didn't teach her what she needed to know, that's why she failed the test, blah, blah, blah. And so I want to be able to defend myself. But I also want to be able to show the kind of progress that she's made so that not only do I get credit for being a wonderful teacher, but people realize how hard this girl has worked and how much progress that she's made. So let me give you some specific examples of how this can be done. So let's say in the area of oral language, okay, there's an instrument that's called the SOLEM, or the Student Assessment of Oral Language Matrix, okay? And so I could point out, hey, Trin was classified as a level 1, a beginning level student at the beginning of the year. She's now on level 3. She's at the advanced level. Here's an audio clip of how she sounded at the beginning of the year. Notice how she was able to only talk in 1 or 2 word utterances because of limitations in her vocabulary and syntax knowledge. Now listen to this recording I recorded of her last week. Okay? And so there you can really show a student's growth in their oral language that way. And then how would you synthesize that for the entire class? Well, you could say, for example, 90% of my students moved up at least 1 English language proficiency level. 4 of my students this year were reclassified as fluent English proficient students. Okay? So there's some successes that weren't captured on the STAR test. So in reading, okay, we have these things called running records. We also have things like book logs and graphic organizers. And so I could document that Trin started the school year reading books at the kindergarten level. Now she's reading end of 2nd grade books with 90% accuracy. Her book log shows she read over 100 books this year. Note that she began with simple picture books, and now she started to read grade level chapter books. Here's a story map that she made of a book she read last week, so you can really see that she's actually comprehending what she reads. Okay? So she didn't get to that magic bar of 3rd grade reading, but she made 2 years worth of growth in reading that wasn't captured on that test. And synthesizing that for the whole class, we could say 85% of my students moved up at least 1 grade level in their reading ability. 60% have moved up 2 grade levels in reading. Together as a class, we have read over 2,000 books. Okay? So again, that's not showing up in these state assessments, but we can document it. Okay, how about in writing? Okay? We do things like journals, we have writer's workshop, we have rubrics that we use to grade students' writing. So I could point out at the beginning of the school year, Trin had difficulty just writing a single sentence in English. Take a look at her journal from the first month of school. Notice how she wrote just a few words in English to label her drawings. I also let her write in Vietnamese at the beginning until she gained more confidence in writing in English. Now look at her journal from December. Note how she was able to write 1-paragraph stories all in English. Here's her journal from this month. You'll see that now she is writing longer stories with several paragraphs, and here are some of her published papers from Writer's Workshop. Okay? Again, that's not going to show up on the state writing test, but clearly massive, massive progress. Thanks to your instruction, thanks to the student working hard. Synthesizing it for the whole class. At the beginning of the school year, most of my students were getting 1s and 2s on the writing rubric. Now 85% of the students are getting 3s and 4s on their writing. Okay? So there are ways to put that on. We can do the same thing for content area like math and science and other things. Portfolio assessments where we collect samples of these really work. And so I found it very effective, too, to have these materials together. When I had parent-teacher conferences, we would sit down and we would look at these things together. And more importantly, when my principal would sit down with me to look over my test scores, I could pull this out, put it in his face, and say, now look me in the eye and tell me I'm a failure. That's not failing, is it? That's success. That's progress. And that's the kind of stuff we want to be able to show. All right. So, talking about advocacy, one of the first things that I think we all need to be involved in is working for changes, policies, and practices that are harmful to our English language learner students. And so I'm going to give you two things that you can actually do this week. The first one is to go to this website here. I'll give you a minute to write it down, wh.gov/E, small n, and then 2. And what this is the White House has this petition process, as you may have heard of. Okay, it's the one that like lots of people sign for Texas to secede from the Union. But it's the same process. And so the rule of the White House is, as soon as a petition gets 25,000 signatures, then the administration has to respond to it. Okay, and so we have a real opportunity here to get 25,000 signatures. We need 25,000 by Valentine's Day. And it's a real simple process. You go to that website, you click a link, it sends you a little thing in your email, you click that to be registered, because they want to make sure you really mean it. If you just click something and that's it, then you're not serious. But if you go through the process of checking your email, registering with the site, and it really only takes a couple of minutes to do this whole thing. And then with a couple of clicks, then you've signed this petition. This petition just went out yesterday. And as of this morning, it had about 198 signatures, and I started seeing it popping up on Facebook and other places. And so I'm pretty confident with your help, and as you pass it on to your other networks, that it's going to send a clear message. And really what the petition is saying is they want the Obama administration to recognize that test preparation can violate the civil rights of students in terms of the amount of instructional time that's focused on the tests, in terms of the kinds of things I've been talking about. And ironically, President Obama has come out against No Child Left Behind. He's made statements against the amount of high-stakes testings that are being done. But as we look at the policies that have come through Race to the Top, and we've looked at the policies that are coming through the waiver process that these 34 states have gone through, there's still a heavy focus on high-stakes testing. And nothing in those waivers that have been sent out from those 34 states clearly articulate how they're dealing with their English language learners. And so we need a lot more work in this area. Okay, the second one is if you're free next Saturday, jump in a car, go to Austin, and join this march and rally called Save Texas Schools. Some of you may be familiar with that already. If any of you are with Northside, Superintendent John Folks has been one of the main drivers behind this effort. So we just won that lawsuit, and so they have a judge telling the legislature, yes, you have to spend a lot more money on schools, on teachers, on kids. And so this is a rally to make sure that they get that message. So it starts at 10:45 on Congress Avenue Bridge at the Capitol. There'll be a march from there to the Capitol. And then there's a rally from noon to 1:30 right at the State Capitol on the South Steps. So get a car, get together. And if you go to this website, they're actually arranging transportation. So I think there's already buses that are set up to go from San Antonio to Austin. Or if you get enough people from your school or whatever, you can actually organize a bus. But this is an important way to make our voices hear, that it's not okay to slash all this money from the budget while ranking up the expectations and not accounting for this rapid growth in our English language learner population. Okay, so two things you can do this week. Okay, if you can't make Saturday, at least take 5 minutes to go to that website. Okay? And then other things we can do throughout the year, of course, writing letters to policymakers, especially your own legislators, writing letters in the newspaper, organizing meetings with policymakers and your legislators. And then at the district level, there's all kinds of things you can do. Every district has a committee that looks at ESL standards. There's the LPACs. There's also district and state committees that you can be on. And so get on those committees. Make sure that the issues and challenges facing the English language learners are being heard and addressed. Especially you guys at the classroom level. You know what's going on because you deal with this on a daily basis. And if they're always just bringing in district level people like me from the university who come in, we're not dealing with the realities every day like you are. And so it's imperative that we have classroom teachers on these committees, district, state level, making sure that these things are being addressed. Okay, other things. Professional organizations that are focused on English language learners. Two of the big ones nationally are TESOL and NABE. TESOL is the Teachers of English as Speakers of Other Languages. And then we have our local affiliate of that, which is Tex TESOL. Okay? And then we have NABE, which is the National Association for Bilingual Education, and our local affiliate of that is TABE. And so we can get involved at both the state and the national levels. And then another one that's is good for resources is the Institute for Language and Education Policy. James Crawford is the main driver behind that, and there's quite a few resources and updates on policy issues there. Now, there's a lot of other professional organizations that aren't focused on ELLs, but they have a specific strand within their organizations. And so, for example, the International Reading Association, they're actually having their conference here in San Antonio, I think in March. And there's several sessions and feature sessions that are focusing on English language learners. And then there's the National Council of Teachers of English, National Science Teachers Association, Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. All these are resources of professional organizations that are very concerned about English language learners. Okay, and then sometimes we get in this rut of like, okay, I went to school, I graduated, I don't need to read anymore. But I expect my students to read, okay? So really, once we become a teacher, just like in any other profession, can you imagine a doctor who like never read any more medical reports or things after they became a doctor, and they've been practicing for 20 or 30 years, okay? So as professionals, we need to keep up with the field. We need to be aware of the latest developments. We need to be aware of the policy changes that are coming and things like that, and the latest research. And so these journals here are really your pipeline to the profession. So some of the journals like the Bilingual Research Journal, the English Language Teaching Journal, there's international journals, and then TABE is our local Texas one, and TESOL Quarterly. Then, these are more kind of the academic research articles. And then there's the more professional journals and magazines. So things like ESL Magazine, Essential Teacher, and Language Magazine are more geared towards the classroom practice level. And then a lot of the professional organizations such as NABE, TABE, TESOL, Text TESOL, et cetera, have their own newsletters, and so that's a good way to keep up with what's happening in the state. Okay, and then the internet has been a great resource in this area. And there's a lot of great blogs. One of my favorites is Education Week. How many of you are familiar with Education Week? Okay, it's a national magazine or newspaper, comes out once a week, and it's only focused on education, K-12 education really. And they have blogs that are associated with the newspaper, and they have a reporter whose specific job is to focus just on ELL issues. And so she'll write regular articles for the newspaper, but then she also has a blog where she'll put additional issues on there, and you can subscribe to that for free. And that's called the Learning the Language blog. I'll grab some water here. And then what you see, some of the other people here, some of our best national advocates that we have. How many of you know who Diane Ravitch is? Have you heard of Diane Ravitch? Let me tell you, okay, I got one person. Let me tell you about Diane. Diane used to be our enemy, and now she's our friend. Diane was a leader of the U.S. Department of Education, I believe under, is either Reagan or is Bush Sr. And was very much against bilingual education, was very much in favor of high-stakes testing. And she's done a complete 100% turnaround, and she's now one of the loudest advocates fighting against No Child Left Behind, fighting against the proliferation of high-stakes testing and others. In fact, she's going to be at the rally in Austin on Saturday, so you'll have a chance to hear her there. Susan Ohanian is a well-known educator and also known for being very loud. She has a great website where she challenges a lot of the issues that are going on and giving us good information. I'm sure you've heard of Stephen Krashen. Okay? He's got a very nice website where he shares information. And then we have professional organizations such as the Center for Applied Linguistics, the NABE, TESOL, TABE also have great resources on their websites. And Twitter. How many of you have a Twitter account? Okay, too few of you. Another thing you can do to advocate for your ELLs is to sign up for Twitter, www.twitter.com. And type in these names right here, because it's the same people up here. Diane Ravitch, Stephen Krashen, Susan Ohanian, and then Alfie Kahn is another national figure who's been very vocal. And you'll get 2 or 3 messages a day through Twitter. Do you get them? They send out a lot of stuff, don't they? But it keeps you informed of what's going on and how to fight for things, okay? And it's always fun to hear from them. Okay, parental involvement, okay, is very important. We want to be able to make sure that parents are welcome. And I worked at a school one time where we kept the gate locked and parents couldn't get in unless they got fingerprinted and photographed and all this stuff. And then we realized that we were locking parents out, and so we had to make a lot of changes to get parents onto campus. Holding parent and family literacy nights throughout the year, getting them on those key committees. Taking parents to those local and national conferences. NABE, for example, has a huge parent institute, and a lot of those sessions are held in Spanish. And so if they're Spanish speakers, then they can participate in that and work with other parents and network. And then, of course, accommodating parents' language needs. Our PTA meetings, our parent-teacher conferences, we need to have translation available. In fact, if we're not doing that, we're actually in violation of federal law. So that's key to have. And then finally, I don't have time to go over this in detail, but one of the other important things you can do for professional development is to do an action research project in your own classroom. And that's where essentially you identify an issue, an instructional issue with your students, and then you try some kind of intervention and you measure to see how it's working. You can read all the research that you want, but a lot of that research isn't necessarily going to apply to your own classroom, is it? So you can do your own research in your own classroom. And I've had a lot of teachers in my courses over there that have done this and really made a lot of great instructional changes based on their findings. Okay, Nadia, I think I'm out of time, right? All righty. Well, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
And then you have to go up there. Now the student's responsible for explaining, hey, this is what we've been doing. Okay? So I love Apple TV for that. Some of the other reasons that I like this is that you can play like music in the background. Okay, that was what was supposed to be y'all's welcome here. But as you kind of come in, you have that soft to do. It can be playing in the background, help keeping those students calm. Okay, when it's time of reward, miss, can we have our music? We can't have the cell phones or any of that. Okay, let's pick a station. You can put it on. You can stream Pandora. You can, if you have downloaded stuff, you can stream that. So it's just very versatile, okay? And again, it still has all those touch features and the mobility where I can say pass the iPad, okay? So this works if you have a class set or if you just have one, excuse me, that you're moving around the classroom. Okay, does that kind of help explain what it is? Okay. And then again, you can just toggle back and forth between your system, so you're not limited just what's on your iPad and then as well as just what's on there. Did you have a question?
Yeah, about the Apple TV.
Uh-huh.
Is that just a one-time fee, or is there a monthly subscription to that?
For which part?
Apple TV.
On this, it's just, you just buy this is what it looks
I
like.
think about $99, right?
Yeah, you just buy this, and once you have this, that's all you need. Like if you choose to, like get in those Netflix or anything like that, that's yours, you can do that, but I don't do that. I just find it and I store it on the cloud, and then whatever's on my iPad, I
Do
pull
you
up.
have
So,
Wi-Fi in your school?
Yeah.
No.
so you just have it connected, you just have to be on we have a special network just for the Apple products. Because like if I was in a room and I do inclusion, if the other teacher had an Apple TV and we're working on something, I can go over there and connect to their Apple TV with my iPad. So you really do have that.
And it also works through iPod.
I
iPod
don't
Touch.
know. It should, because like on the little picture, when I was getting pictures, it had the iPhone, the iPod, and the iPad with Apple TV in the background, so
Okay.
I'm assuming it all connects that way. Okay, any other questions on that? Okay. Now, why use the iPad? Okay, it's easy to use, okay? I have never been an Apple user. I got my first iPad again when I joined the program a year ago, and it's just kind of it's fun to explore it, okay? It's interactive. You can choose the apps to go in there. It's a lot of touching, maneuvering, a lot of problem solving involved. The mobility, okay? That's what I talked about. You can move around while you're going in the classroom. I'm just not stuck up here. I can go, okay, hey, are you on task? You know, that proximity to keep the special ed student on task, getting your body close, you have that availability. Okay, it keeps my kids excited and engaged. Okay, students become the teacher. So just like I had that example where, excuse me, where I had, you know, hey, show me what you're doing, they have to turn around and explain. Okay, sometimes it gives them a little bit more comfort sitting from their chair, able to show what I did versus having to come
An introduction, so let everybody get in their seats. Welcome to Universal Design for Learning with Dr. Maria Kaler. Just to let you know, following this session, you'll be given an hour for lunch, so it'll be from 12 to 1, and the next session will resume in this room at 1 o'clock. So now that that's out of the way, let me introduce your presenter. Dr. Kaler is in her 10th year at UTSA. She has experience teaching at the elementary and secondary levels with all disability categories. Her research focuses on improving learner outcomes through the use of technology. And just as a side note, I've known Dr. Kaler for a long time before she was Dr. Kaler. She was actually my soccer coach in high school. So, see, you never know when your students are going to show up again. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaler.
Okay, I feel a little old after that introduction, but that's all right.
I didn't say how long.
Yeah. I also feel a little powerful since I know I'm the only thing keeping you from lunch. So we'll get started here with our session on universal design. And basically today we're going to try to accomplish a couple of things. Two main things in the presentation is understanding what universal design for learning is and identifying the 3 principles of universal design, which are the foundation for everything that you do within the application of that framework. So just a little bit about universal design. It's not a new concept. It's actually a concept that came out of the field of architecture, and it was first applied in making physical spaces accessible to everybody. So in the day when, back before we had all the laws where we had ramps for individuals in wheelchairs and before we had elevators in every building, we had to either accommodate people in other ways or they weren't able to access certain areas. So out of architecture came the universally designed buildings and physical spaces. And they've applied universal design to learning environments for a while, and it's been out there, and there's been some research out there, and some of the websites and resources have been available for a while, but it's just now really making its rounds into our classrooms and into education as something that is important and something that is a way to provide more accessibility to individuals, and they refer to these individuals as individuals in the margins. So we're not only talking about individuals with disabilities, we're also talking about individuals who are gifted and talented, and just individuals who have other kinds of needs. So I just want to up front say that, you know, even it's not coming out of the field of education, but as it's applied to the field of education, it's applied to, sorry, get a little echo up here. Applied to education in a way for all learners. So it's not just something that's strictly limited or used in the field of special education. Okay, I got my computer's going up here. Okay, so what is UDL? UDL is not, you can read up here what it actually is, but I just want to make the note that it's not a curriculum. So it's not some curriculum that you can buy and go take to a school or take to your classroom and just apply. It's a set of principles that can help you guide your planning and guide your creation of new curricular materials for learners in your classrooms or learners in schools. So it's principles. So it's applied to maybe things that are already out there. Even if you have lesson plans or you've been teaching a while and you have certain ways that you do things, you can still take these principles and apply them to improve and maybe even create new materials. Okay, but again, it's not its own curriculum. It's not something that you'll be able to go buy at the store or anything like that. Buy out of a catalog. It's just a set of principles. And why would we want to use Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, in our classrooms? And it's because learners are different. We're all different, right? We all have different likes and different needs and different interests. We enjoy different kinds of movies, read different kinds of books, eat different kinds of foods. And in the same way, in our classrooms, we have students who are very different. They learn in different ways, and we can think about learning in those different ways in one of the most common ways that we think about learning with modalities. I think that's the first way when we talk about how students learn and how they learn differently. A lot of times we immediately go to, you know, students who learn better through, you know, visual or auditory or kinesthetic ways of learning. But it goes even beyond that. So that's one area that it does address. But everybody's different in our own learning styles. We bring our own interests to the classroom. We bring our own experiences to the classroom. So everybody's unique when they come into that learning environment. So, okay, it's probably hard for you to tell, but I have a little voice issue today. So I've integrated some videos in here also just to help further explain and to give us some more information, additional information about UDL and what it is. And so the first one we're going to start off is just, again, a more in-depth, more, I think, bigger scope of definition for UDL. So, can y'all hear that? Yes? Okay.
This teacher needs to meet a curriculum goal, and she's got a very diverse group of students. And so does this teacher. And this one. Most do. In fact, research shows that the way people learn is as unique as their fingerprints. What does this mean for teachers of today? Classrooms are highly diverse, and curriculum needs to be designed from the start to meet this diversity. Universal Design for Learning is an approach to curriculum that minimizes barriers and maximizes learning for all students. Whoa, that's a fancy term. Universal design for learning. Let's unpack it a bit. Let's think about the word universal. By universal, we mean curriculum that can be used and understood by everyone. Each learner in a classroom brings her own background, strengths, needs, and interests. Curriculum should provide genuine learning opportunities for each and every student. Now let's think about the word learning. Learning is not one thing. Neuroscience tells us that our brains have three broad networks. One for recognition, the what of learning, one for skills and strategies, the how of learning, and one for caring and prioritizing, the why of learning. Students need to gain knowledge, skills, and enthusiasm for learning, and a curriculum needs to help them do all three. But every learner is unique, and one size does not fit all. So how do we make a curriculum that challenges and engages diverse learners? This is where the word design comes in. A universally designed building is planned to be flexible and to accommodate all kinds of users, with and without disabilities. It turns out that if you design for those in the margins, your building works better for everyone. Curb cuts and ramps are used by people in wheelchairs, people with strollers, and people on bikes. Captioning on TV serves people who are deaf, people learning English, people in gyms, and spouses who get to sleep at different times. UDL takes this idea and applies it to the design of flexible curriculum. UDL goes beyond access because we need to build in support and challenge. So how do we use the UDL framework to make learning goals, methods, materials, and assessments that work for everyone? First, ask yourself, what is my goal? What do I want my students to know, do, and care about? Then ask, what barriers in the classroom might interfere with my diverse students reaching these goals? To eliminate the barriers, use the 3 UDL principles to create flexible paths to learning so that each student can progress. Number 1, provide multiple means of representation. Present content and information in multiple media and provide varied supports. Use graphics and animation, highlight the critical features, activate background knowledge, and support vocabulary so that students can acquire the knowledge being taught. Number 2, provide multiple means of action and expression. Give students plenty of options for expressing what they know and provide models, feedback, and supports for their different levels of proficiency. Number 3, provide multiple means of engagement. What fires up one student won't fire up another. Give students choices to fuel their interests and autonomy. Help them risk mistakes and learn from them. If they love learning, they will persist through challenges. And remember, always keep in mind the learning goal. Get rid of barriers caused by the curriculum and keep the challenge where it belongs. And that's it. Okay, quick recap. Show the information in different ways, allow your students to approach learning tasks and demonstrate what they know in different ways, and offer options that engage students and keep their interest. Universal design for learning equals learning opportunities for all. For more information on UDL, go to www.cast.org.
All right. So that's it. Y'all know everything now. Okay, so that was just an intro video talking about what UDL is, but again, there's a lot more to it, and we're going to hit on those 3 principles again and probably a couple more times today, just so you hear them in different ways, you hear them presented in different ways, you see them presented in different ways, so that when you leave here you understand about those 3 principles and can define universal design. So again, just recapping a little bit what they said is that the 3 major brain networks that we have are recognition networks, our strategic networks, our affective networks. Recognition, of course. Sorry. The what of learning, how we gather facts, how we categorize what we see and read. So in a classroom, identifying words and letters, that would be some skills that you would use under the recognition network, brain network. We have the strategic network, or the how of learning, planning and performing tasks, how we organize and express our ideas. And examples of this in the classroom might be writing an essay or solving a math problem. And then we have effective, the why of learning. How learners get engaged in the learning process and how they stay motivated and how they participate in that. How they are challenged, how they get excited, interested in what you're doing in the classroom. Those are all part of the affective dimension, affective brain network. So when we talk about UDL, and this again is just a little bit of background so we know that it actually comes from research-based area or research-based field, is that UDL uses the three brain networks to, they base their three principles off of the three brain networks. So again, the UDL principles, the first one, provide multiple means of presentation. The second one, multiple means of action and expression. And the third one, multiple means of engagement, are linked to the brain networks. Okay, so you can see recognition, multiple means of representation, and then here the strategic network, and then the affective network. So that's how they are linked to, the principles are linked to the brain network. So basically how we learn, three different networks that we have in our brain for learning and engaging in the learning process, those are the foundation, the basis for the three principles that they've designed Universal Design for Learning, that concept on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these. This is the third time, see, so we're going to repeat them several times, so you should know them at the end. But there's more to them than just that title. So under each of these, multiple means of representation, they each have guidelines underneath them. And the guidelines are basically ways that you can see exactly what that means. Okay, so multiple means of representation has a guideline of providing options for perception. So for example, that could mean focusing on making, or it focuses on making information perceptible to the learner. So providing the information through different modalities. We talked about modalities, auditory, visual, kinesthetic, so different ways that you provide those materials to the learner. Providing information in a way that the user can adjust. So ways that maybe the user can enlarge text or amplify sound. Okay. So you can see that guideline, how it ties to multiple means of representation, how we can present that information to students. Now under each guideline, so we have three principles. Under each principle we have guidelines, and under each of the guidelines we have checkpoints that you can look at as ideas or ways in which you can incorporate these checkpoints or these ways into your design, into your planning, into your lessons. Now I will tell you now, because I know some of you are probably out there trying to make notes and say, oh my gosh, this is so much. I'm going to give you a ton of resources at the end of this, and there'll be one website pretty much that you can write down that you can be able to link back to all of this kinds of information. Okay, just in case you're wondering. So checkpoints for guideline 1. Guideline 1 was providing options for perception. So different ways that we can look at this, ways of customizing the display of information, alternatives for auditory information, and alternatives for visual information. Okay, can anybody think of any examples? An option for auditory. How do we usually give auditory, or how do you think of auditory information being relayed to students in a classroom? Teacher speaks. Okay, so what are some other ways that we could introduce that? Yes? Music, okay. What else? Rhymes, videos. And we have tons of technology now, so videos would be a good way that we could actually do that. There are also ways when maybe it is teacher information needs to be provided, a teacher pre-records or records books. And I know some of you, how many of y'all are actually teachers in the field? So there might have been a time in your career that you recorded, maybe textbooks that you didn't have recordings for, that you wanted students at the listening stations if you're elementary teachers. So just optional or different kinds of ways that you can provide that information to the students. And the third checkpoint here, visual information. There's a lot of different ways we can provide visual information to students. Traditionally, we provide visual information through, what do we use in the classrooms most frequently? That would be the next level, I would think, but even more than textbooks. And then whiteboards or chalk, well, I don't even know if we still have chalkboards, I don't know. Maybe in some schools, unfortunately, but whiteboards and even smart boards, a lot of, and that's an interactive way that we can provide information to the students. Okay, so we're still in the same principle. The second guideline is providing options for language, mathematical expressions, and symbols. And basically, when we're looking at these options, a lot of it has to do with, and I want to preface this by saying I know that according to our state curriculum, according to the TEKS or TEKS, whatever you want to use, however you want to pronounce that, there are things that students have to know. Like they have to know the proper symbols in math for addition and subtraction, and they have to know the equal sign. But what we're saying here is that sometimes in the learning process, that can be confusing for students. So sometimes using the symbols that they have to know, that needs to be an outcome for them eventually, but there are ways of getting there that could be less confusing for the students. So an equal sign might be a way of showing that things on two sides of an equation are equal, but there might be other ways that we can present that to a student that make more sense to them. And it might be that they're at a place where the equal sign or seeing it on paper isn't going to do it, but maybe manipulatives on, two boards sitting right next to each other and they show equal parts. That might be another way. So just different ways that we can provide visual information and different kinds of information to students. Now, I'm not in any way, and universal design is not in any way saying that we disregard the need to understand the formal symbols and such that we use in our education. It's just in that learning process we can provide access to learning those objectives through different kinds of means. Some checkpoints, clarifying vocabulary and symbols. Now some of this you're going to say, I do this, what do you mean this is new or this is universal design? I do this because I'm a great teacher in my classroom. Clarifying syntax and structure, supporting text, understanding across languages, and illustrating through multiple media. So these would be checkpoints. And again, the checkpoints are ways when you look at the guidelines under the principle to say, am I doing any of these kinds of things in my classroom? If not, these might be some ideas that you could use and incorporate in your classroom to make that learning accessible to everyone. Guideline 3, still the first principle, provide options for comprehension. Here are some of the checkpoints. Now, I know that some of this, when we taught our lesson planning and such for the classroom, that we automatically do this, supply background knowledge, patterns, critical features, big ideas and relationships. So a lot of this might look very familiar to you, and again, you might be thinking, well, in what we taught and how to write our lessons, we do this anyway. Towards the end of this, I'm going to show you a comparison. There's a link I have that's a comparison between a traditional lesson and then one that's using the same objectives and applying the principles of universal design. And you'll be able to see how you do this. And you have to remember that it's not so much whether you do these things or you don't do these things, but a lot of it is how you do them. So if you are activating or supplying background knowledge prior to reading a book that you're going to need the students to comprehend or to show you their understanding of what's occurring in that book, there are ways that you can go about getting the student to that point besides a lot of traditional ways that we use, which are we read as teachers, students read individually, students read as a class, we have worksheets, we have activities, we write papers. There's a lot of different ways that we can get there and make it more accessible for students who maybe don't learn best or won't gather the information or the knowledge they need through just a traditional method like that. Okay, so now we move into the second principle in Guideline 4. So we have our first principle and had 3 guidelines. Now we have our second principle, multiple means of action and expression. This is about providing more than textbook or workbooks. Okay. That limits how learners navigate or interact with the curricular material. So if we only provide a workbook or worksheets or a textbook, then we're counting on that, and it is a very traditional model in schools. We're counting on that to be the primary source for learner information. We're counting on that to provide everything the student needs to gain the knowledge, usable knowledge out of that textbook or off of those worksheets if it's practice worksheets. We need to provide materials that meet the needs of learners in a seamless way. Examples include like switches, maybe voice-activated devices, special keyboards, lots of other things that we can think of, especially in such a technologically savvy age. We can think of a lot of ways that we can offer students the opportunity to get the learning they need, to get usable knowledge so that they can create new learning for themselves by providing options for accessing what it is we want them to access in our curriculum. Vary the methods for response and navigation. So let's talk about response. When we talk about opportunities for response for students, what do we typically think of? Teacher questions, students raise their hands and answer. We give a test, students write their responses and write their answers. What are some other ways that we can think of that maybe we can have students respond to us in our traditional? Yes? Projects, okay. And projects is a good example, and even so in projects, maybe even we talked about the importance of this for students. that they have different interests. It might also be that they get to pick a topic, pick their own topic, their own interests. If you're teaching them research skills, then it is important, is it important for you as the teacher to decide what that topic's going to be for the student if you're looking at their research skills? Or might it be more important that you get them interested and engaged by letting them pick the topic, and through that topic they can demonstrate their acquisition of the research skills? What are some other ways that we might vary methods for response? Portfolios? How about if you're reading a story and you want the student to be able to describe or summarize, instead of writing a summary, could they record it, just in a little audio recording? Could they tell the story? If they read different stories within the classroom, could students tell the story to another peer? So just different ways of them expressing that kind of information to others outside of the more traditional ways. And it's not that the traditional ways don't work, it's a matter of having choices and making decisions about what individual students need, knowing their needs. And in that short video, they talked about removing the barriers, and this is what we're trying to do. No one way, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's about having a huge selection of ways to access that material for students. We also have optimizing access to tools and assistive technology devices if necessary for the students. Again, we're still under principle number 2, guideline 5, options for expression and communication. Different modalities, and we talked a little bit, it ties a little bit into the other, but into what we just talked about, but also I think this goes a little bit further into not just expressing what it is we're asking them, like, I need you to demonstrate something for me, but what are your ideas that stem from this? Kind of open-ended, inquiry-based kind of learning environments where the students can come up with their own ideas and maybe investigate those ideas, where it's not an assignment or something that's given to them and said, this is what the outcome needs to be. It's more open-ended. Multiple media for communication. Multiple tools, so this is all about multiple things. Building fluencies with graduated levels of support for practice and performance. We talk a lot about scaffolding, but we here can talk about levels of support. So we talk about not just scaffolding, we're scaffolding the learning, but we're also scaffolding the amount of support or the ways we provide support for the student. So typically if we are introducing something that's more difficult for a student, we offer a lot of support and gradually let that support lessen and lessen as they go so that they can at the end complete whatever it is with little support or without any support at all. Because ultimately we want our students to be independent learners and to have the skills that they need to regulate their own learning and to be able to participate in that learning process. Guideline 6, options for executive functions. So basically we look at human capacity to act skillfully is what we consider the executive functions. So basically at the lower level of those in that area, and this is probably one of the more, I would say, difficult guidelines to actually incorporate and trickier ones to incorporate, but looking at how we can scaffold those executive functions as skillful functions, like basically teaching them their own skills, like self-regulated, self-monitored skills and ways that they can go about accessing their learning, and at very low levels of that really providing a lot of support, and then at the higher levels of executive functioning or where it takes a lot of skills but the student is very skillful in doing that, where we basically provide again less and less support for them in those areas. I mentioned a term a minute ago, self-regulated, but in here in the checkpoints we're looking at goal setting, planning and strategy development, managing information and resources, and enhancing capacity for monitoring progress. So we go back to that self-regulated learning. So as a student, it's not just about always doing what the teacher tells me, but starting to take ownership of my own learning and understanding what I need to do, what skills I need to have, what I need to accomplish, how to set goals to get there, and not just a one goal, at the very end, but how do I build that? How do I backtrack? How do I know to go from point A to point B? And if I'm looking at point B and I look back to point A where I'm at, how do I fill that gap in? How do I know how to move from one point to another? Planning and strategy development, and that's part of that. It's not just planning. So now I know what I need to do, but what strategies can I use to get there? Do I have the knowledge? Do I have the skills? Do I have the tools that I need to get to where I need to go? Managing information and resources, that's also important, because one thing we don't want to do with students, right, is just teach them how to use something for one given point in time and then they don't know when they should generalize and when they should use that again. We want to make sure that they know when they gather information and when they have knowledge, what they're going to be using that knowledge for, why it's important, and how they're going to be able to use it again. And of course, monitoring progress. Beyond the teacher's gradebook, students should have an understanding of where they stand and how they are moving or progressing along whatever goals are part of their learning. Okay, here's the third guideline. We're almost through principles. We're almost through the principles, multiple means of engagement. Of course, I always think this is the most fun here myself. So basically, options for recruiting interest, individual choice and autonomy. I mentioned that as an example earlier in a project that maybe they could select their own idea for that. In some cases, we could even look at them if they have very high level of skills and understanding and planning, that we could actually say, these are the objectives and I need you to demonstrate your knowledge of this concept, that we actually let them design whatever kind of project it is that they feel comfortable doing. And students may choose different things. You might have students want to do a portfolio. Some students might want to do a research paper. Some students might want to do a mini book. So there are a lot of different ways that they could access learning from this direction. Relevance, value, and authenticity, and minimize threats and distractions. So removing all the extraneous things that might interfere with that process of learning. Options for sustaining effort and persistence. So looking at the goals and objectives and having the students understand what the most important thing is, because sometimes, and we're all different, so sometimes people are real good at setting goals and you can clearly see a goal and you can clearly see the steps that you need to take to get to that goal. For other people, you can set a goal and you can do sub-tasks or sub-goals underneath that, but when you look at it priority-wise, it all looks the same. So this is the same thing for students. When you say, I need you to do this or I need you to get to this point, everything looks the same. Everything is equal to them. Where we as teachers or educators can look at it and say, but this is not equal. The biggest thing is at the end, and all of these are smaller, and under these small things we have these teeny things. So having students gain an understanding of that part of the learning process. And then guideline 9, options for self-regulation. It talks about promoting, and you see this, promoting and facilitating. So we see that we're part of that process, but it's not us doing for. Okay, so these are guidelines. Promoting expectations, beliefs that optimize motivation. So what are we doing, but also what are we teaching the students so that they can do this for themselves? Okay. So again, it's a lot of information. 3 principles, and under each principle we have our guidelines that help us determine or give us ideas for how we can implement those 3 principles. And then we have checkpoints that we can look at our own teaching and our own design, our own curriculum, our own lesson plans and determine how we are incorporating that in there. I'm going to, I think, no, I won't skip this. I'll just take you here real quick. So one of the resources, because I know we're going to be a little short on time, and I'll give you in just a minute, but just so you know, you don't have to remember every single thing here and how there are so many resources out here for you to use so that you can begin to look a little more in depth at Universal Design for Learning. These are examples of resources, so you can see over here on the right are all the checkpoints that we just went through very briefly that you would be able to access, and you can click on any of them. And here's examples, and there are resources. And these are the key considerations. Again, when I said there's principles and then there's guidelines, and the checkpoints help us look back at what we're doing. They help keep us on track. Kind of a self-check to see that if we're doing what we think we're doing or we say we're doing as far as universal design is implemented. We can look at this and these key considerations. Is it helping the students meet the goal? Does it account for variability? And can learners customize the display, because that particular checkpoint had that in there. And here are some tools that you can use within your lessons or within your classroom to help meet these goals on the checkpoints. Okay, that's just one example. Let's see the time. We're going to skip that. That's just revisiting the 3 principles. We'll skip that. Let's talk about the resources that are available to you. So if you really want to get more, there's a lot to learn about universal design. And again, we watched a short video, and I've gone through and talked about the 3 principles of universal design and the guidelines under each and the checkpoints. And there's no way that just sitting here, looking at this and hearing them say it and me talk about it and seeing it on the screen, you're going to gather all of that. But the purpose is really just to give you an introduction and let you hear those terms a couple of times so that you can walk out of here hopefully understanding what universal design for learning is and understanding that there are 3 main principles that we can apply to our planning and our curriculum development to use in our classroom so that the learning in the classroom is accessible to all the students, and that it's not just accessible by students sitting in the classroom, because technically in here, the learning's accessible to every one of you, but am I making it accessible in a way that you're actually going to walk out of here with learning? And that's what you need to ask yourself when you're in the classroom. Are the students gaining usable knowledge? Okay, and so that's what we need to think about with universal design. So now you're in a short session, and so we're going to go back, we're going to look at some resources so that when you leave, if this is something you really want to investigate and look at it a little bit deeper or maybe incorporate in your classroom, you can go back to these resources and they can help you start planning for universal design. Now what I would recommend you do first of all is look at this website. It's CAST, and it's the Center for Applied Special Technologies. I'll click on it here. Transforming Education Through Universal Design for Learning. Now, one of the things that's really tricky about the site is it has everything you could ever want to know, and if it doesn't have it on this site, it has a link to it to another site. But you can get really lost in this site. So you're going to be real careful and make sure if you're looking for one thing, you kind of stick to that path, and I would go back to the beginning and go, because you can get so lost that you can never get back, and you'll think, oh, I want to remember this, but I'll just back click a couple of times and it won't happen. So here you can look up here about UDL. Here's what it is. Has a little bit more here. The guidelines here. So it has a nice guidelines here. Talks about them. It's capital CAST, all caps. That if you just put it in Google and you just put CAST, it'll be the first link that comes up for you. So it has everything here. Talks about the brain, the networks, more about those. It brings up each of these different areas with the definition here. Here are the guidelines, the checkpoints, and you can click on these checkpoints. And here's a description of the checkpoint, and then over here you have examples and resources. So we can link you through, all through there. Okay, so CAST is a great place to go. It has a wealth of resources in there, but I'm going to guide you a little bit more specifically depending on what your interests are at this point. We also have the National Center on UDL for Learning. Now CAST and this site, they have links that are the same, so sometimes CAST will link you to this place, and sometimes this place will link you back to CAST. Like here, if you want to learn more about UDL, it will take you back. But this is another place that really has done a lot of study and research, more research I would say than CAST, in looking at universal design and the use in the classroom. Okay, so you can look at the UDL Center. There's basics, advocacy, so different people have different interests in the field. So that's another resource you might want to look at. And those 2 sites, CAST and this site, the National Center on UDL for Learning, I would use mostly as gaining background knowledge and just clicking and exploring and reading and kind of piquing your interest. And then you might want to focus in a little bit more. So if I'm a teacher and I think, well, before I invest a lot of time in this, what else can I do or what can I gain from this? You might want to look at some of the resources that are available. Okay, again with these checklists over here. And over here you can find different links to different resources for incorporating different types of learning into the classroom or different means for learning, a lot of media kinds of things that you can use. You say, okay, I'm kind of buying into this, I think I might want to try, but what does it really look like? So as I said earlier, we can look at a sample lesson. Okay, so I'm just going to click on this one, Understanding Plot and Vocabulary, grade 9 and 10. Okay, and you can see the purpose of the lesson. Designed to engage students in reading and comprehending part 1 of the story, developing vocabulary, and analyzing plot elements. Okay, so they're going to use the monkey's paw to complete these kinds of objectives using vocabulary, develop vocabulary skills, complete a plot diagram. So we can go through the different parts of it. So this is a very traditional approach. So we know that's all what we want to do, but traditionally this might be what we do, and I think we've all seen this, right? We pre-teach our vocabulary words before the student reads, and we have them practice taking a test on the words. We use worksheets. You know, you draw the lines to match. So that's a traditional approach. And then giving a test composed of multiple choice and short essay questions. Sounds very familiar. Okay, that's why we've been teaching a long time. And in some cases, in some situations, that's most appropriate. But another option would be looking at more of a universally designed approach. So here we have the critical features of the day's lessons, the day before's lesson, new learning, which I think we all do as we model. We talk about what we're going to do for the day. New vocabulary. So in the other traditional one, we talked about introducing or pre-teaching vocabulary, giving worksheets and giving little quizzes. Here they have some different kinds of activities that you would use. The story was written over 100 years ago, talks about words that aren't used today very often, so explaining those and focusing by having students select words from the vocabulary list, and then they talk about using multiple means, PowerPoint slides projected on a computer, printed copy of the text and images on the side, a word list. They can use, here they have, right here I'm looking at Beck's procedure, prioritizing words. So just bringing in different ways that students, and you can see immediately that moving from a traditional approach where students only have one means of accessing the words, a list that you put on the board or whiteboard or a vocabulary list that you gave them, and then pre-teaching them by maybe having them write the definitions out of the book, the glossary or out of a dictionary, and then quizzing them on those words. We can see that we're providing them different ways to access the words here by giving them choices, presenting it to them in different ways. And it might be that you have several of these opportunities or options within the classroom. Okay, so they give you some examples here. The video clip. They have graphic organizers. They have guided practice. Using 10 words in context to show how an author might write them in the story. They can write their sentences by hand or enter them on the computer. They can work with a partner. So all sorts of different ways that students can access the information, again, to meet the variable learning needs or interests of the students. And then assessment. So using, when you assess them in that way, you have them do that activity, you'll assess them using that same kind of activity. So you won't have them completing that activity and then assessing them in a multiple choice test. You'll probably observe them completing the assignment as you need to complete. So just an example. And here is more, I'm not going to go through all the lesson plan, but you can see how different it is and how much more spelled out this is for you. But it's a great place to go. Look at this and think, you might be thinking, I do some of this already, but there are some things that I could add that might enhance my lesson and remove some of the barriers for some of the students who I feel are having difficulty or who are struggling in the classroom. Okay, so I gave you a couple of sites to go to, some resources, and sample lessons. So if you're really going to buy into it, and I'm going to wrap up here real quickly. There's videos on there. We're not going to have time to go to that, but I just want you to know there are videos in there of what it looks like in practice. And if you want to get started with it, the starting point I would recommend is from the CAS site. You can go onto the top and it'll say professional development, it'll say online modules. There's a couple of online modules that you could actually complete on your own. It says get started here, and this is an introduction to UDL. Interactive learning experience, so it's basically you going through and participating in some universally designed activities for yourself. So again, those other links are just piquing your interest, seeing if it's something that you want to learn more about, then examining and actually learning more about, and then when you're ready to use it and you want to get focused, you can actually start with the modules. It's a very organized way of going through universal design for learning activities and learning how to apply those principles to your planning and to your curriculum in your classroom. And I think I'm going to have to wrap it up right now. Right? I appreciate your attention today, and I hope that we're going to be able to post the presentation somewhere. Okay, so all the links are in there. So as you're going back, if you want to look at that, you can just click towards the end of the presentation, and all the links will be in there for you in case you want to go specifically to something and not get lost within the CAST site itself. Is that it for me?
That's it for you.
All right, thank you very much.
So the kid hits 10 times a day. He only hit once today. That's a success, okay? Share successes with the family, no matter how small they are. Whether that's in a phone call, an email, and a daily communication log, you must share successes of the family. If you don't, you're going to burn the parent out by always telling them the negative, by always sharing the bad. No matter how difficult that child is, and I've experienced some very difficult children, there are successes. You just have to look for them sometimes, but there are successes. Share those successes. Don't forget to share them. Discuss any new information or challenging information with the parent up front. Don't let the first time they hear something new or challenging or difficult be at the yard meeting. Here's Mom, here's all of you, and you're going to tell me something new for the first time in front of all of you. I'm going to experience embarrassment. Okay? Don't do that to the family. If there's new information, challenging information, have a meeting with that family first. Not in front of all of you guys, because all of you guys may know about this challenging information and this difficult information, but you don't have to, what the parent's going to feel like, attack them all together. So the special education teacher and the gen ed teacher meet with the mom beforehand. You know, there's this challenging information that we're going to need to talk about at the yard, and I wanted to give you some time to think about that first so that we can really come to the yard and problem solve how we're going to try to make some changes here so we can see something different and better. Don't let challenging information or new information be shared for the first time at the yard meeting. It's going to put the mom on the defense. So you're telling me this for the first time in front of all of you guys. I'm embarrassed. When you're embarrassed, what happens? You shut down for one. I heard someone say shut down. Do you get angry when you're embarrassed? You get angry when you're embarrassed? When you get angry, are you in a place where you're willing to work with other people? No. So the process just stalls. Okay? Share information that may be challenging, difficult, or new prior to the yard meeting. All right, so what can you do at the yard? Again, listen. The parent may have not have shared something with you earlier, and now she has all these experts in the room. So I'm going to tell you this information today because one of you know the answer. So you may not feel like you have the time to listen to Mom, but Mom is seeing, I've got all these experts. Maybe you can give me the answer. So she wants you to listen to her so that you can give her some insight. So listen, and listen some more. And then, again, tell the parent about successes. You cannot do this enough. The parent needs to hear the good things that's happening with their child. Because trust me, they hear the bad stuff enough. They hear the bad stuff from the other siblings of their siblings. Life isn't fair. So-and-so does this. So-and-so gets this. They hear the bad stuff from HEB. I just gave you that example, but HEB, parents criticizing parents. So they hear the bad enough. Tell them successes. They don't hear that enough. I assure you they don't hear the successes enough. Sorry, I'm not being very good with you taking pictures. That's not what I wanted to do yet. Sorry, pretend you didn't hear that. Okay, identify the most trusted adult in the room. And it's usually either the special ed teacher or the general education teacher because that's the person that the family has the most interactions with. So instead of setting up the room like this, all of you against Mom here, have Mom and Dad sit next to their trusted person, the most trusted person in the room. Oftentimes that doesn't happen. It's all of the professionals and it feels like against the family. So mix that group up some. So have the family sit next to the trusted person. And that will help Mom feel a little bit more comfortable with the process. Have the trusted person talk to Mom. Not the computer, not the screen on the wall. I'm having a conversation with you, Mom. And I'm going to walk you through the paperwork, even if it's page by page. Do little things that help develop that trust. Offer some comforts. So again, it's an intimidating process. The parent's coming in uneasy. We've already talked about that. So a bottle of water. It's just a tiny token, some chocolates on the table. A tiny token that's going to help the mom be more comfortable. Now I have something in my hand. I have a bottle of water in my hand. Offer her paper and pencil. Mom doesn't always know that she's coming to this meeting and maybe she needs to take notes. Offer her some paper, offer her some pencil. Again, I have something to keep my hands busy. I have something that I can write down when I have a question or I have a concern, something that she can do. So give the mom something to make her more comfortable at the meeting.
Testing, testing. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks. I'm glad you guys are all still here. Hope you enjoyed the day and learned a few things. Please remember, if you want to continue the discussion, you're more than welcome to join us on Moodle or forums. We still have a lot of people asking questions and commenting on things that they've learned today. So you're welcome to join us and do that as well. Let's go ahead and begin our final session for today. So welcome to Mathematics and the Bilingual Brain with Dr. Nicola Wicha. Dr. Wicha is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at UTSA and an assistant professor at Research Imaging Institute at UT Health Center in San Antonio. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and Spanish from UTSA. She received her PhD in Cognitive Science from the University of California at San Diego. Dr. Wicha's research focuses on understanding how the brain processes language in real time using both behavioral and brain imaging techniques. Currently, a primary focus in her lab is understanding the unique processing capabilities of the bilingual brain. Dr. Wicha is also pursuing research to understand how language intersects with other aspects of cognition, such as mathematics. Her research is funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and National Institute of General Medicine and Sciences. So please help me welcome Dr. Wicha.
Okay, am I on? Sounds like it. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming back. I know it's been a long day for you guys and a dreary day, so these days make me sleepy. So hopefully I'll make it interesting enough for you guys to stay awake for another hour, and then you can go home and chill out with a beer or whatever is you're looking forward to. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I was actually very honored to be here with you guys, and I'm a little surprised because I'm not sure what you can learn from me, being a scientist, and you guys are being out in the real world and in the classrooms. So, but at the end of the talk, I actually would like to hear from you guys to tell me what I should be studying, okay? To learn a little bit more about what you guys are experiencing in the classrooms to understand how scientists can improve the classroom. So let me get started here. First, I'm going to give you a very short introduction to the technique that I use, that I'll be the data that I'll be talking about. And this is 6 slides that I would normally teach in a semester course, so get ready. It's a semester worth of information in 6 slides. So just to begin with, we have to keep in mind that the brain is an incredibly fast computational machine. It processes information really, really fast, whether it's language or math or whatever it is that you're trying to understand. Just as an example, when you're listening to me right now, your brain is understanding about 3 words per second. That's super fast, right? And it has to get all that information, parse all of the sounds and the syntax and the meaning, and then come up with the ultimate goal, which is to understand what I'm saying. So we need tools that can actually allow us to study the brain when it's actually operating in real time. And that's the tool that I use actually gives us an advantage, the advantage of being able to look at that. So this is just a diagram of many different techniques that we can use to study the brain. Not all of them are necessarily good for the human brain. And it just sort of plots things in relative scale in time. So down from milliseconds all the way up to days and years. And then it also plots in relative space. So how closely, is that me? That's my necklace, isn't it? Oh, sorry. That's very bothersome. Let me take off my necklace. So it plots the relative scale of how much we can study in the precision and space in the brain. So for example, If you're looking at a single cell in the brain, you're looking down in this area, where you're looking at one single cell. If you're looking at the whole brain, then you're way up there on the scale. The technique that I use is a technique that is up there in red. It says MEGERP. It's also EEG. So it's a technique that doesn't allow us to look very closely at individual cells in the brain. It allows us to look at the whole brain, but it gives us really, really good precision in time. So when we're looking at things like language and math that are really fast processes in the brain, this technique allows us to look at things that are happening very quickly and keep track of rapid changes of activity in the brain. Does that make sense? But it doesn't allow us to look where in the brain these things are happening. So that's one downside of the technique. This is bothering me. I'm sure it's bothering you guys. Okay, so the technique that I'm going to be talking about is called the electroencephalogram. And this is a brief little overview of the science, in case any of you are out there are science teachers or aiming to be science teachers. So this is your brain. This is the left hemisphere of your brain. So this is this side of the brain looking that way. This is the back of the brain, and this is the cerebellum. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Heard of the cerebellum is related to motor control and things like that. And so what we're looking at is the technique that I use looks at the very surface of the brain. We look at cells that are in the very surface. And if I were to pull out one of these little pieces, you would have this little section of brain tissue that's full of these little cells called pyramidal cells. And they're called pyramidal cells because they're shaped like pyramids. If you take this in three-dimensional space, they're shaped like little pyramids. And these are the cells. They're about 90% of the cells in cortex, which is this outer surface of the brain, are pyramidal cells. And it happens to be that those cells are the ones that are doing all of the communicating with what's related to cognition. So those are the cells that send information from one area of the brain to the other and things like that. So it turns out that they're cells that we want to study, and fortunately, those are the cells that we're actually recording with this technique. So when you get this signal, an EEG, and how many people have had an EEG or an EKG or something like that in their lives, EKGs? So it's the same principle. You get this little electrode that you stick on over your heart or over your scalp, and it picks up the electrical activity of our brain. We are emitting electricity at all times, just like a light bulb. We're emitting electricity, very tiny amounts, but with really precise electrodes, you can actually pick up that electrical activity. And what we look at are changes in that electrical activity. And we look for changes that are consistent. So if there happens to be some particular change in that electrical activity, that's a signature of processing math, for example. Okay? So that's what we're doing with this technique. And we take these little pieces of EEG and add them up over and over and over again. And what we end up with is something called an ERP, which is an event-related potential. And this event-related potential is just a piece of EEG that is related to a specific event in time. So if I show you a picture of a dog, and I measure your brain activity from the moment you saw that picture of a dog, that would be the event-related brain activity. Okay? All right. So that's all you need to know about this technique, except for how to look at it, because I'll be showing you data like this in this talk. So that's the raw EEG. This is just the continuous recording of electrical changes in your brain, and that could be related to your heartbeat or to your brain. And what we do is we take lots of pieces of that, average it together, and then we get this piece of data, which is event-related to the thing of interest. So for example, if I'm looking at a simple math problem, 2 times 7 is 15. 15 is obviously the wrong answer. I see some eyebrows furrowing. It's like, this girl doesn't know what she's talking about. What we're looking at is for changes in this brain activity when comparing, for example, the correct solution, which would be 14, and the incorrect solution, which would be 15. And we can actually measure how the brain activity, this brain electrical activity, changes in response to these events. Okay? So that's what I'm going to be showing you. And basically, to orient you, this is the kind of data I'll be showing you today. This is 1 second of brain activity, okay? And these are all the different things that are happening in that 1 second, that fast, okay? All the other techniques that you've heard of, like fMRI and PET scans, those things take a picture of your brain over several seconds, so 6 seconds and often 10 seconds. So if this many things are happening on the order of 1 second, then how do you, the MRI can't tell you anything about this time course, okay? So this is the value of this technique. And then on the other axis, this way, is voltage. So voltage, just like when you're measuring a light bulb or the voltage coming out of your electric socket, that we're doing the same thing here, but we're measuring it on microvolts, okay, on a millionth of a volt, a little tiny thing. And so they're very small changes, but what we're looking for are differences in this. So you can see right here an obvious difference here between the brain response to correct and incorrect solutions in that problem. Okay, so that's what we will be looking at. And when I show you pictures like this, where there's sort of a distribution over the head, what I'm showing you is that electrical activity over the surface of the scalp. It's not the brain, because we don't know where it's coming from. We know it's coming from the brain, but we don't know exactly where it's coming from in the brain. Okay? Got it so far? All right. You guys passed my class. All right, so what are the advantages of this technique? It's a very inexpensive technique. It's non-invasive, right? We're just recording from your brain. We're not doing anything to your brain. It's an incredibly valuable technique for special populations, like young children, pre-verbal children, because you can look at the brain's response to language or to math or to any kind of concepts before the child can express themselves or press a button or give you a response, okay? So the brain does all the work. And we do this even with our adults. We ask them sometimes to give us responses, like behavioral responses, but we look at what the brain is doing independent of what the person is doing. And that sometimes is really interesting because we can find that sometimes people think they're doing something, but their brain is doing something else. Okay? So it's really interesting that way. Okay, so now that's enough about the brain. Now I'm going to tell you about some of this research that I've been doing here in San Antonio with regard to bilingual arithmetic. So what's the question? As mentioned earlier in my introduction, is my main focus is in studying language in the brain. And what brought me to arithmetic is trying to understand the role of language in arithmetic. And what do I mean by arithmetic? Well, there are different kinds of arithmetic. There's exact arithmetic, which is something like 2 times 7 is 14, which are concepts that math cognition people think that you've basically memorized them and you extract them from memory. These are not things that you necessarily calculate. Then there's things like that are approximate arithmetic, and I say, well, what's closer to 2 times 7, 15, or 10? That would be an approximation or an estimation. So those two kinds of arithmetic are thought to be performed in very different parts of the brain. And I'm not sure, I think that's supposed to be a slide rule. I got this off the internet. So if you're using exact calculation, it's somewhere over here in the temporal frontal region of your brain where that's actually playing a role in accessing, in getting to that information. But when you're doing estimation, like telling me which one's taller, that is in a completely different area of the brain, and it's usually thought to not have an interface with language. Okay? So the kind of math that I'm going to be telling you about is the kind that's this exact math that appears to be very dependent on the language in which you learn it. Okay, so as you know, approximately 1 in 5 school children in the US is bilingual, and many different forms of bilinguals, whether they're fluent or not. But this means that these individuals who are bilingual can access math concepts not only in the form of digits, but in the form of 2 different languages. Okay, so if those of you who are bilingual in English and Spanish in the room, I can say 2 times 7 is 14, and I can say 2 por 4 son, 2 por 7 son 14. And you would be able to get the same concept eventually. So the question is, does it matter which language it's in? If you're hearing one language or the other, does it matter? Are you able to get to the information regardless of what language it's presented in? I'm going to skip over that one. Here, this is a simple framework of what math cognition people think is happening in the bilingual brain. That we have 3 separate stores of these concepts. There's one for digits, one for English numbers, and one for Spanish numbers. And within each one of these are connected to each other the stronger language is connected more strongly to the digits, and the weaker language, the one that we are weaker in, is more weakly connected to these digit concepts. Within each of these, within each one of those stores, there's this network of concepts that you've memorized, that you've learned. So 2 times 7 equals 14 is a concept that you have stored in memory. And that is connected to a bunch of different concepts. And some are very connected, like the correct answer. Some are related, and some are more distant. These are supposed to be different colors, by the way, but it doesn't look like they look like very much different colors. So some are more distantly related than others. And when you try to retrieve an idea, there's a spread of activation. There's a spread of information in that network that you can get to. And so the idea is the language that you learned your information in will have this very rich connection of information. And so when you're operating in that language, you can get to concepts very quickly and efficiently. So how do we know that this is happening in the brain? How do we represent this spread of activation in the brain? Well, this is the brainwave that I showed you earlier. Remember, this is time and microvolts going this way. And what we see is there is a big difference in brain activity at this point in time between correct and incorrect solutions. So there's the correct solution and the incorrect solution. And if you just take, everybody has done line graphs where you have a bunch of numbers on a line and you have to draw that line. That's all this is. This is just point by point values of voltage, and they connected them on a line. So if you take each one of those voltage differences and subtract them from each other, -2 + 3, you end up with this. Okay? So I'm going to be showing you both of these kinds of slides. This thing is the two conditions, and this is the difference between them. So if I subtract this line from this line, I get this. And it makes it real easy to see anything that's different from the 0 line, which is right here, means that there was a significant difference between the two conditions. So this is the brain's response. About 400 milliseconds after the moment that you see that solution, 2 times 7, 14, your brain has this response when it's incorrect. And the idea is that's reflecting this ability to get to related information in this memory network. The bigger this is for wrong answers, the stronger that memory network is. So if you are stronger in English, you should have a bigger response than if you're operating in Spanish, and so on. Okay? So this is a way that we can actually measure what's happening in the brain and really see which language people are using more effectively to get to these math concepts. So, and why are we looking at this at all? Well, there seems to be some data showing that when somebody learns these simple math concepts, like 2 times 4 is 2 times 7 is 14, in one language, that they get to it faster in that language than in another language. And there is also some evidence from a study by Bernardo in Tagalog English high schools in the Philippines, where they're learning their native language at home, and their home language is Tagalog, but their school language is English. And even though Tagalog is their stronger language, they access these concepts better, these math concepts better in English, because that's the language that they've learned the math concepts in. So there's some evidence for this idea. So what we wanted to really look at is, first of all, do you need to go through language to get to those math concepts? Okay? Because if it is true that you have stored this information in a language, then that means that you need to go through language to get to the concepts. So the first question, and this is very relevant for bilinguals, is when I see a digit, do I need to go through my language system to understand what that digit is? And so we did use this technique. This is one of the students in my lab, where we put a cap on their heads, about 26 electrodes, and had the subjects read. These were just young adult bilinguals. We were just looking at sort of the end state bilinguals, college students. We're hoping to move this to children eventually, and I'll tell you more about that later. And we presented problems like this. They saw one thing at a time on the screen, and they saw the number 2, the number 4, then the number 14, and then they got a question mark, and they had to answer whether or not that was correct. And we looked at their behavior here, but we looked at their brain response here to see if their brain was processing this information differently, whether it was in the digits, whether it was presented as, correct or incorrect, whether it was presented in English words or presented in Spanish words, okay? So they were, 50% of the time the answer was correct, 50% of the time it was incorrect, and we were looking for that brain wave that would index that they're accessing the information efficiently. And then we compared that brain wave across the 3 formats to figure out first, the first question we'll talk about is if they were able to access the digits without having to go through language. Okay, so what would you think? If you're looking at time, and you have to go through your language system to get to that information when you see a digit, what would you expect the brainwave for the digits to be? Would you expect the brainwaves for the digits to be earlier or later than the language brainwave? There was both, earlier or later. So you got a language brainwave and a digits brainwave. And if you have to go through language to get to the concept in order to understand the digit, which one would be faster? Language, right? Okay, so good. So let me get to the data then and show you, sorry, too many slides. So this is just that plot again, the raw data. And we converted then to this is congruent, so that nice little blip where you see the incorrect response and the correct response. And then we subtract the two and we get this nice little waveform. This is the waveform for the digits, okay? This is the brainwave for the digits. If we expect language to be faster, then language should be here, okay? But instead, language comes after. And this is a significant difference. It doesn't seem like a big difference to us, but to the brain, it's a lot. It's 20 milliseconds. It takes 50 milliseconds for information to get from your eyes to your brain. So 20 milliseconds is a long time for the brain. And what this shows is that we don't need to go through language to get to digits. You are able to process the digits faster than language. That's a good thing, because that means that regardless of how many languages I speak, I can still get to those digits without having to go through my language. So that shouldn't impair me too much if I'm going through using the digit format. So the second question, so do we require language? No. The second question is the language of training always, or the language of learning, always the language that people refer back to? Is it always the language that bilinguals have to use to get to those concepts? Okay? And so here's the digits again, and here's the brain response to the language of learning, and here's the brain response to the second language. Okay? They look very similar. It's just to show you that we get a very similar brain response in the same time. And when we subtract them and overlap them, the language of learning and the language of and the second language are no different from each other as a group. We were totally shocked because all the literature says that the language that you learned it in is the language that you're going to be able to get to it in better. But it turns out that that's not the case. We looked at, this is 44 bilinguals, and these are bilinguals who are fluent in both languages, okay? So when we looked at it, we thought, well, maybe what happened is that this task is just so simple. 2 times 7 is 14. Is just so easy that you just can't see a difference between the groups because the groups are they're all doing it really quickly. So we thought, okay, well, if that were the case, then you wouldn't see any difference between anybody's 2 languages, right? If you looked at a single individual, there should be no difference between their languages. But in reality, what we found, and what I'm showing you here is a plot of each one of these dots, these pairs of dots. The blue and the green represents one subject. The blue is their language of learning, and the green is their other language. And what you notice here is that some people are, just to tell you, the ones that are further down, so if you're below, it means you're better in the language. If you're up here, it means you're worse in the language, okay? And so basically what you see is some people are better in their language of learning, some people have no difference between their languages, and some people are completely the opposite. So across the population, there's all kinds of possibilities. Some people are accessing it in one language, and some people are accessing better in the other. What's really interesting, if you take that and you plot it linearly, these are the same subjects. And this means everybody who's down here does it better in their language of learning. Everybody who's up here does it better in their other language. And it's a continuum. Like if you just sample the population, there's a continuum of possibilities. This doesn't make it very easy for teachers, right? Because it's like, well, if anything can happen, then what? Well, get this. We thought, well, maybe this is because they are themselves more dominant in one language or the other. The yellow circles are the people who are dominant in the other language. No pattern. It doesn't explain why. And then it turns out that only 4 of these 44 people said that the language of learning was not their preferred language. And yet, almost half of them are doing it in that other language. So that means that even though behaviorally they think that, oh, I always have to do it in English because that's the language I learned it in, their brain is doing something else. Okay. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that it's a lot more complicated than we thought. And this makes it complicated for everybody. But how do we explain this? How do we explain this variability? Well, maybe it's because even though we were looking at people who are fairly equal in terms of their language ability, we're looking at people who have different experience with how they use their language for math. So we wanted to test this idea to figure out if experience using the concepts in one language or the other could change this pattern of behavior. Okay? And so who best to look at other than bilingual teachers? So these are individuals who are themselves bilingual and who were teaching at the elementary school level in one of their languages. And the way we set it up is we're going to do the exact same paradigm, but the way we set it up is that half of the teachers were teaching in their language of learning for math, okay? And this elementary school, so they're teaching math concepts on a regular basis. So half of the teachers are teaching in the language in which they learned math. The other half are teaching in the other language. And the idea is, if you have a language of learning advantage, then it shouldn't matter which language you're teaching in. You should always be better in your language of learning. But if experience makes a difference, if your experience using those concepts in the other language makes a difference, then that difference, that ability you should see equal ability in both of the teaching and the non-teaching language for the mismatch group. I didn't say that very well, but I'm going to say it more clearly in just a second because I have a slide for it. So we had 14 teachers and from the community. This was done in San Antonio, so some of you out there might have been part of this study. We did the exact same paradigm where we measured the brain activity right here to the 3rd number and measured to see which language they were processing more efficiently in. And what we found was that if you take the data and plot it as the language of learning, which is LA+, and compare it to the other language, those people who were, when you look at the teaching languages, so people who are teaching in the language of learning, teachers who are teaching in the other language, there's no difference between the languages. But if you look at the non-teaching language, you see this big difference in amplitude and in time, where they're faster and more efficient at processing in their language of learning. So it seems like if you don't reverse that language of learning effect, you're going to have a big difference in processing. You're going to be faster at accessing those concepts in the language of learning. But those teachers who actually use their other language, they kind of made up that difference. Now they were equally efficient and fast at getting to those concepts in either language. So these are adults. But what does this tell us then about other bilinguals, for example, children? This is an indication that experience with using the concepts really matters. So even if your language of learning is not the language that you're using the math in, using those concepts in the other language is going to strengthen that network, that memory network that you have in your brain for that language. Okay, so that's where the differences are. And so in conclusion, how am I on time? I have no idea. Oh, okay. So in conclusion, what we found was that our brain data shows that you don't have to go through language to access those concepts when you see the digit 9. You don't have to go through the language to get to it, which is a good thing because if you're operating in the digit format visually, then language doesn't interfere with your ability to learn as a bilingual child. And the second thing we learned is that balanced bilinguals, these adult balanced bilinguals, show evidence that there isn't this strict asymmetry where you always go to your language of learning. There seems to be a strong effect of experience that can change each individual's ability to get to those concepts. But importantly, we see a very similar type of brain response in both languages. So it's not like the brain is having to do something completely different in each of the languages. You saw this perfectly overlapping brainwave in the bilinguals for each of their languages. So that's an indication that it's not like the brain is having to do something different and accommodate and somehow compensate for not having learned those concepts in the language. It's just a matter of using that information more frequently. And then finally, our bilingual educators showed us that it really is an experience-based change. So what about your classroom? How can you use this information that I told you today? You always have to be careful when you take research and try to apply it in the classroom because it's tentative. Research is always tentative. There could be a study tomorrow that tells us something completely different. But for the moment, what we've learned is that bilinguals can access these concepts in both languages, and the brain doesn't do it very differently. So you're not at a disadvantage necessarily if you're bilingual. So this is a hurrah for bilingual education. We don't have to make kids learn in one language in order for them to get the concepts. They can get to the information in both. Eventually, what matters is experience. So for example, if a child is having trouble in one language, there is a lot of data showing that allowing them to use their mother tongue in the classroom allows them to learn the concepts better. But rehearsal of those same concepts in the other language is going to allow them to get access to those concepts as well in the other language. So it's going to even out that disadvantage from the language disadvantage. And what else have we learned? That, well, we still have a lot to learn. And in particular, some of the questions, actually, I had a grant at the NIH that was reviewed yesterday. And I don't know, I'm biting my fingers. I have no more fingernails. But these are some of the questions that we'd like to address in that grant. One is looking at what's happening during the learning period. So everything I've told you about today is in the adult. But we'd like to take this into the classrooms. And there's a couple of questions here. On the one hand, you have children who are already bilingual. Okay, by the time they reach third grade and they start learning these math concepts, they already speak 2 languages fluently. So the question is, what happens when you're already bilingual and you're learning these math concepts compared to people who have already learned the math concepts and now are having to become bilingual? So before and after that arithmetic learning period, what's the difference? So if I'm already bilingual and I'm learning these math concepts, am I transferring the information between the 2 languages? Well, maybe I'm not at a disadvantage at all because I'm learning it simultaneously through both languages. Whereas somebody who learns the second language later, so ELLs who come after third grade, may have a much more challenging time because they've really learned that information in one form. Okay, so that's one question I'd like to ask. Another thing that we're trying to address in future research is looking at different bilingual programs, immersion versus dual language versus ESL, and looking at the impact of these different forms of learning on accessing these concepts in the long run. And so just to conclude, I'd like to ask you what kinds of things you think are important for bilinguals when learning math concepts. And I'm done, by the way. All right. So
your graph was showing the peak, I guess that's the recognition phase, whether incorrect or correct.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the trough afterwards with coming back. Is
Yes.
that a reset period?
Yeah, so a lot of people think that after that positive thing that happens afterwards is reprocessing.
If you start to cram into that, encroach into that area, are you causing problems with the process with the next?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, and we don't know. That would be sort of a matter of timing. If you give a person enough time versus doing things more quickly, and so
There may be a minimum
amount of time to press. No, and it's a very good question, and we purposefully left enough time so that we could see that nice, clean brain data. But if the next time, it's actually a good point, we could squish it together and see if cropping that time to reprocess is affecting further processing downstream. That's a really good point. 10 minutes. Is that 10 minutes of talk time or 10 minutes of questions? And question and whatever, okay? So how many of you are actually teaching these math concepts in the classroom? 1, 2, 3. A few of you are doing it already. I'm not going to pick on you, I promise. But maybe I will. No, but so have you encountered any issues with? Yeah. So the math concepts I'm talking about are simple arithmetic, things that you learn by rote memorization. And so it's a very specialized type of concepts. It's the type of concepts that seem to be most affected by language, outside of the obvious effect of language, which is instruction. Okay, so if you're actually speaking to a child who can't understand you, that's going to be an effect of language too. But I'm talking about somebody who is bilingual but cannot get to those concepts because they learned them in one language versus the other. So, yeah.
In my classroom, I teach, it's 90% Spanish and 10% English.
Mm-hmm.
But I, like, as far as math concepts like colors, counting, road counting,
Yeah.
identifying the numbers,
Mm-hmm.
to me, I see the process as almost equally in both languages.
You mean you're teaching them in both languages?
Yes, I teach them in both languages, and I feel that the students are able and have been able to learn them both ways
Mm-hmm.
without any problem.
Yeah, so that's great. I think that based on our data, that's that's the right thing to do. Is these things that are what we call like sort of rote memorized. You know, when you sit there and do 2 times 2 is 4, blah, you just over and over again, or rote counting. These concepts, you're rehearsing them verbally. You're saying them to yourself. And so I think that our data indicates that it would be beneficial to do it in both languages.
Of course, you use visuals, like you use the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with the colors, you use the visuals. They're able to, I think, process the simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So you have but see, this is actually one study that we're doing in the lab right now. One question is, when you see the digit 9, what do you hear in your head? If you're bilingual, you can hear 1 or you can hear uno. And so the question is, what language are you actually rehearsing? What is that sound that you hear in your head? And so we're doing that right now in our lab, trying to figure out what language even these digits are linked to when you do see them. So what are you hearing when you do them? So that's a big question. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you're looking into doing this with younger students.
Yeah.
It would be awesome if we could have it, at every school in a few years.
And yeah.
To decide whether the students should be receiving more instruction in English
Or Spanish or both, or yeah. So there's a nice model that we propose. I don't know if they're going to accept it or not, but there are different kinds of immersion programs, right? There's immersion. In some people are pro or against. I'm not for either. I don't know that much about education, but there is a model for English immersion for Spanish speakers who are immersed into an English environment, and then you have the Spanish immersion. In schools like in the Alamo Heights district, there's the inverse. So we can look at these different populations, extract out things like socioeconomic status, and look at what impact that learning environment is actually having on these concepts. And so we're trying different models, and then looking at dual learning and seeing how this affects it. And really, the primary thing that we'd really like to do first is to look at children who are bilingual before or after this math learning period and see how that trajectory changes that individual's experience with the 2 languages in getting to the information. Yeah.
I have a question. Basically, when you're saying someone is bilingual, that means they are thinking in both languages? Because most people only think in one language.
So it turns out people do think in both languages.
So they do bilingual.
So it turns out that bilingual to me means you speak another language to any degree. Some people define it as fluent in both languages, but to me, anybody who speaks a little bit of another language and can communicate to some degree in another language is bilingual. They are dominant in one language, but they're bilingual. So it turns out that people who are fluently bilingual actually think simultaneously in both languages. There's a lot of new data showing that you can get interference from your other language, even when you're only speaking one. You can get interference from the other language. And this happens to anybody who speaks two languages. Occasionally, you'll get this word from the other language will pop into your head, and things like that. So this is part of the problem of doing bilingual research. Mm-hmm.
Is there a point where they start thinking more in one of the languages?
Their research shows that yes. So there's this crossover point that happens when children turn 5, and I'm talking about children who enter the school. Dominant speakers is typically the Spanish English, who are home language is Spanish. They enter the school system. Primary language is English, and about 5 years of age, the two languages come together, and then English becomes dominant. And so I don't know how you would define thinking in the language, but yeah. To yourself, yeah. So you would have that crossover that usually happens in the early elementary school. Yeah. Right. The delay may happen slower. Yeah. The crossover may happen slower, or it may not happen at all if they're way late in developing that second language. And yeah.
Have you looked at children who are in the military? Because I remember when my dad was stationed in the Philippines, there was English at home, and then he began to learn the Philippine language.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was stationed in Italy, and he began to learn the Italian language.
Mm-hmm.
So we began to learn different languages, and I'm sitting here thinking, I don't ever remember really have to decide what language I was going to learn.
Those concepts in. Yeah.
Because if I recognized it, I recognized it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I do remember, mainly going to DOD schools, there's of course English, they're going to different English. When you go home, you run around with your Italian friends.
Right.
They're using their language. So
Mm-hmm.
you're color switching back and forth to
Mm-hmm.
each other. But I don't ever remember it became, I'm going to talk to you, but today I'm talking to you in Spanish.
In English or in Italian. Right. When that happens, yeah.
When I'm going to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is the beauty and the difficulty of working with bilinguals. Is every bilingual has a different story. Every bilingual has a different experience at home. Some of them have cousins and uncles they speak with locally. Some of them it's just their parents, and so every single bilingual has a different history in how they use their language. And what we're finding in our research across the board is that you have to look at experience on an individual basis, because it changes completely how you use your language in the current period. And it can change even over your lifetime. You can use English a lot when you're a child, and then Spanish when you're older, and your dominance, your ability to get to that information is going to flip completely based on your current use of the language. So it really does make a difference. There's one interesting thing that maybe some of you might find interesting. There's a part, everybody knows about, sorry, let me start over. Everybody always asks me, so why is it that some people can learn languages, second languages really easily, and other people can't? Well, for a long time, we didn't really know why, but a colleague of mine at UT Austin they found this part of the brain called the inferior colliculus. It plays a role in processing sound. It turns out that if you have a really good inferior colliculus that follows sounds well, that there's actually a brain wave that is exactly like the sound itself, and if you played the brain wave back through a speaker, it would sound like what I'm saying. The way the neurons they follow the sound very well. So if that part of your brain follows the sounds really well, you'll be much better at learning new languages and mapping on sound to meaning than if your part of that brain doesn't work very well. So there may be some basis to that idea that some people are better at learning languages than others. But keep trying anyway. Don't give up, even if you can't. Huh?
Easily measurable?
Yeah, it's easily measurable. We measure it with the same technique, with an electrode outside the head, and you can pick it up really easily. Yeah. Yeah, you think maybe the military will pick up on it. So thank you for listening. I appreciate your time.